Chapter 654. The sky above Jingdo was alternating between cloudy and sunny. It was impossible to accurately reveal a smile or a worried expression, such as Fan Ruo's face. This girl's face alternated between green and white. Her slightly sweaty and slightly red cheeks had been scared into a theater after hearing these words. She fully displayed the emotions a Qing Kingdom citizen should be displaying at this time. It was clearly a warm spring day, but Fan Ruo's body seemed to be tortured in an ice house. A moment later, she said in a low, trembling voice, "I don't know." This was the most useless answer, but it was also the most natural answer. Fan Xian had already fallen into a black hole and was unable to free himself. If he held his sister's hand, at most, he would have another pitiful junior torn to pieces. It would not be of much help to the matter. Fan Xian's heart softened. He gently stroked the girl's head and warmly said, "Don't be scared, silly. It's just that there's no place to reason with, so I can only talk to you." After a long time, Fan Ruo looked at her brother with a timid gaze and said in a mosquito-like voice, "Is it true?" Fan Xian was silent for a long time. His gaze turned to the quiet and secluded little courtyard across the river. He thought of the bloody knife disaster this little courtyard had suffered 20 years ago. He thought that perhaps 20 years ago, this place had been hell on earth. Who knew how many people of the old Yi family had died, and that stunningly talented girl had coincidentally been at the weakest stage of her life. She had given birth to him. Furthermore, all the people around her that she could rely on had, for one reason or another, all left her side for important reasons that could not be turned back. She was alone and without help. This was a sudden attack from the place closest to her, a fierce and decisive killing intent. Presumably, when she left this world, she must have been unsatisfied and lonely, right? Borrowed seed? Fan Xian would not believe this. He understood women too well. Even if this woman was his mother, the one and only Yi Qingmei in the world, Fan Xian still did not believe it. If she had no feelings for a man, how could she charm him in her bed? Other women might feign civility with a man they didn't like because of social or family reasons. But did Yi Qingmei need to? Fan Xian stared in a daze at the other side of the river. A cold smile rose to the corners of his lips. That man was truly cold-blooded. A trembling voice pulled Fan Xian back from the tragic scene of the past. Fan Ruo clung tightly to her brother's side, as if she was afraid of the cold. The wet handkerchief in her hand had long fallen to the grass. Her hand gripped Fan Xian's sleeve tightly. Raising her face, she said, "I used to have a brother." A chill suddenly welled up in Fan Xian's heart. He knew what his sister was talking about. He had known since he was a child that there should have been a young master in Count Sinan's manor. That young master should be about the same age as him. He was the son of his father and first wife. However, because of his weak body, he died at a young age. At this moment, his sister suddenly mentioned the elder brother who had long since disappeared from people's memories. Fan Xian vaguely seemed to catch on to something, and his expression immediately changed. Qin Pingping had reminded Fan Xian more than once to treat Fan Jian better, because the Fan family had sacrificed a lot for his survival. What did the Fan family pay? Could it be that the reason he was able to survive in Taiping Courtyard and endure until Uncle Wu Zhu hurried back was because under the fierce attacks of the Empress Dowager, the Qin family, and the Empress's clan, someone had accepted death in his place? Fan Xian's face was slightly pale. He thought silently to himself, if this was how things had progressed. First it was hidden from the Empress Dowager. Later, when Count Sinan raised an illegitimate child in Danzhou, why did the palace not become suspicious? Had the emperor suppressed the situation after returning to the capital and sealed off the news? His head hurt slightly. There were some details he had not thought through clearly, but the possible terrifying scene became clear in his mind. He indifferently thought that when he opened his eyes for the first time in this world, he saw his pair of baby-white lotus-like hands. In front of the hands that were stained with blood, there was already a newborn baby who had died in his place. His baby-like hands were not only smeared with the blood of the people Uncle Wu Zhu had killed, but also the blood of the true young master of the Fan family. Fan Xian's body trembled slightly. Ruoruo clearly sensed her brother's abnormality. Sorrowfully, she said in a low voice, "I don't know how he died." Later, I faintly heard the old nanny in the manor mention it while crying. I have some suspicions, but I don't know what went wrong. Fanxian gently held his sister's hand and didn't say a word. He knew that not long after giving birth to Ruruo, Ruruo's birth mother was bedridden and died. It was only later that his father welcomed Lady Lu into the manor. What was it about the wife of an assistant minister that had been troubled all this time? Was it because her own son had died when he shouldn't have? Ruo then lowered her head and quietly said, "I heard the old nanny say that mother and aunt you should also know each other." Fanxian had gradually come to understand the deeper meaning of Chun Pingping's words. But he still didn't understand. If Chun Pingping knew that his father had paid such a great price for him, why did he still refuse to lower his guard against his father all those years ago? The relationship between Count Sinan and Yi Qingmei was not like the first love that Fanxian had imagined when he was young. Perhaps the two of them trusted each other more like siblings, just like Fanxian and Ruo today. Yi Qingmei had just given birth to a son in Taiping Courtyard. It was normal for Count Sinan's wife to go to the courtyard to help. As for what happened afterward, perhaps it was just as Fanxian guessed. Was it like the plot of a novel? It turned out that reality was always more bizarre than fiction. More accurately, reality should always be more bizarre than fiction. Fanxian tightly held his sister's hand. His heart was filled with countless complicated feelings. Before his eyes floated the face of his grandmother, who had always loved him dearly, and the solemn face of his father. It seemed that he would never be angry, never be happy, and that he would only silently walk the bureaucracy. His heart suddenly ached. He felt that he owed the Fan family too much. His heart suddenly grew cold. Back then, too many people had died and too much blood had been shed. Fanxian stood up and looked coldly at Taiping Courtyard across the river. He suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Don't tell anyone about what we talked about today." Although he knew that his sister would certainly not spread this shocking secret, Fanxian still couldn't help but remind her. He then said in a low voice, "Concerning this matter, I have to ask my father in person. Brother is returning to Danzhou?" Ruo followed suit and stood up, looking at him in surprise. Fanxian shook his head and said, "Father is not in Danzhou right now." The retired Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, was living out his retirement in Danzhou. This was something everyone knew. But Fanxian said with unusual certainty that his father was not in Danzhou, because only he knew that his father was in a place in the northeast, helping him do something important. He had to ask his father in person because he believed that on this matter, his father also had the right to speak. Fan Ruoruo resisted the urge to ask. She only stared in a daze at her brother's gloomy face. Her heart ached slightly. She knew that the things Fanxian said today would stir up a great storm in the future. Fanxian was not only the second most powerful person in the world, he also had too much power in his hands. If he truly had a falling out with the emperor and wanted to avenge his mother, a great battle between ruler and official would probably drag the entire world into it. "Come with me to another place." Fanxian walked toward the path deep in the bamboo forest. Ruoruo made a sound of acknowledgement and followed with small steps. 3 black carriages left the bamboo forest near Taiping Courtyard and came to another eerie place on the outskirts of the capital. The coldness of this place was different from Taiping Courtyard. It gave off a sense of fear because this was a cemetery. Many people had been buried in Taiping Courtyard. Many people had also been buried here. Fanxian had left his old home and come to a place of death. The Overwatch Council officials following behind him all felt a chill. They didn't know what exactly had happened. The feng shui at the foot of the Green Mountain on this side was very good. Buried with the graves of the nameless soldiers left behind by the Qing Kingdom's wars from south to north. Among them, the newest and largest cemetery had been built 3 years ago. During the Jingdo Rebellion, the imperial soldiers had suffered heavy casualties. The Overwatch Council had also paid a terrifying price, particularly the attack on Qin Heng's vanguard camp at Jingyang Gate and the Black Knight's later valiant pursuit in front of the square, which added 1,000 more graves to the new cemetery. The traditional April festival had just passed, so there were still many traces of worship left in the cemetery. Incense and unburned paper money floated quietly in the mountain wind among the graves. Fan Xian brought his subordinates and sister to the graves and bowed deeply toward the cemetery. The people buried here were all his subordinates. They were all people who had died because of his one decision and one plan. Only now did Mu Feng, and the other subordinates know what the commissioner wanted to do. They felt deeply moved and moved. He was about to take over as director of the Overwatch Council. Unexpectedly, after returning to the council to deal with matters, the first thing he did was come to the cemetery to pay respects to his dead brothers. Seeing the commissioner sincerely and attentively bow, the eyes of the dozens of Overwatch Council officials in Qingshan Garden couldn't help but moisten. They followed behind him and bowed. However, they had come in a hurry and had no time to set up anything. Fan Xian took a deep breath and said, "What matters is sincerity. I don't care about other things." To the side, Mu Feng agreed. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then said, after returning to the capital, "Have Mu Tai check on the pensions these years and how the families of the officials in the council have been taken care of. Draft a file for me." "Yes, sir." Mu Feng made a sound of acknowledgement and was not afraid. The follow-up matters of the Overwatch Council's pensions were all handled by the First Bureau. His uncle Mu Tai was the head of the First Bureau. Hearing that Sir Fan Jr. was going to check the accounts, he was not worried at all. In the entire court, only the Overwatch Council's pensions were the highest. The commissioner looked after the families of his subordinates very well. Of course, it was also because Fan Xian had the palace treasury, a gold mine, hidden in his sleeves. Secondly, he knew that his uncle would never dare to make a mistake in these matters. Fan Xian paid no more attention to him. With his hands behind his back, he led Ruo out of the cemetery at the foot of Qingshan Garden, leaving a distance behind his loyal subordinates. It was not until they were about to climb to the waist of Qingshan Garden did he turn his head to look at the densely packed graves below him. He sighed and said, "A general success is built on the bones of tens of thousands." Ruo didn't understand why her brother had come here after thinking quietly for a long time in Taiping Courtyard. Fan Xian seemed to guess what she was thinking. In a low voice, he explained, "I want to use these dead people to remind myself that I am no longer just me. I have to be responsible for many people who are alive and those who are dead. I have to use these graves to remind me and make me more clear-headed and calm." The brother and sister climbed past the waist of Qingshan Garden and turned to the other side. It was said that the feng shui on this side was not as good as the other side, but it was still densely packed with graves. They were all places where the ancestors of the Jingdo people were buried. At this moment, the smell of smoke and fire seemed to float in the air. There were a few large graves on the col separating the two sides of Qingshan Garden. The style of the graves was normal, but they appeared very large. Furthermore, there was a garden outside the graves and soldiers guarding them. A few soldiers saw someone slowly walk in and were about to go forward and yell at him when they were immediately chased out by a few Overwatch Council swordsmen. Buried in these graves were the eldest princess, the crown prince, and the second prince. Fan Xian walked past the eldest princess' grave and the crown prince's grave. His expression did not change at all. In the end, to Ruo's surprise, he stopped in front of the second prince's grave. The Empress Dowager's grave was far to the south of Tsang Mountain. It was 80 li from Jingdo. It was said that it took up a lot of space and was beautifully decorated. It perfectly displayed the emperor's benevolence and filial piety. However, Fan Xian had never been there even once. The Overwatch Council officials scattered in all directions. Fan Xian and his sister stood quietly in front of the second prince's grave. After looking for an indeterminable amount of time, Fan Xian suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Actually, I don't like you very much because I know you and I are the same kind of person. Just as you said the night before you died, we don't like each other. From the first time I saw you, I saw through the bashful smile on your face and knew your hypocrisy." Fan Xian smiled slightly and looked at the grave. Of course, when you saw the bashful smile on my face, you also knew my hypocrisy. However, you can't prove this. You're only subconsciously guessing. Because I hide deeper than you, my smile is more real than yours. Fan Xian's voice was not loud, but appeared particularly determined. When it comes to acting, no one in this world can compare to me. From the day I was born, I was acting. A bashful smile. If you want to pretend to be a baby, of course, you have to learn how babies smile. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. This has already become my natural nature. I only know how to smile shyly. It's so embarrassing. He raised his head and said, Chengze, in the future, when I don't have to smile shyly anymore, I will come see you again. Fan Ruo looked at her brother in astonishment. She didn't know why he was talking nonsense in front of the second prince's grave. What did he mean by pretending to be a baby? Fan Xian stretched in front of the grave. He had long stood up, but the bashful smile on his face had become an impatient and angry expression towards the world. Fan Ruo finally couldn't resist reaching out her hand to touch his forehead to see if her brother had a fever from the shock of the news. In the end, the place she touched was icy cold. Fan Xian was startled by her, but he immediately understood what she was thinking and laughed loudly. Hearing Fan Xian let out a rare hearty laugh, Fan Ruo relaxed and also laughed. However, there was still a layer of haze in her heart. Looking at her brother, she didn't know what kind of hardship and struggle there was in this laughter. Fan Xian calmed down and warmly said, The things I wanted to do today, the crazy things I wanted to do, have all been done. Earlier, you said something happened in the capital. What exactly is it? Fan Ruo hesitated for a moment and then quietly said, The young lady of the Sun family has come to the manor. Fortunately, sister-in-law is not here. She has made Master Ting very anxious. Sun Jingxiu's daughter? Fan Xian paused for a moment. How did a young lady of a noble family make such a fuss? This young lady of the Sun family was the fan who had helped Fan Xian greatly during the Jingdo Rebellion. However, Fan Xian knew this girl's personality. No matter how much she loved the story of the stone, she would not do something so damaging to her family's reputation. She came for her father? Fan Ruo glanced at him probingly. Something seems to have happened on Sir Sun's side. He was so anxious that he couldn't do anything. I think Miss Sun was also forced to come by her father. A gust of wind came from the mountains and made Fan Xian's clothes flap loudly. It made his brows furrow. He couldn't resist cursing. However, his voice was very low. Even Fan Ruo, who was standing beside him, didn't hear clearly. Concerning Fan Xian's slightly bashful smile, ever since I started writing about the year of Qingyu last year, there have been many people who disliked it. Furthermore, in many places, they expressed confusion about how I wrote it. I have never explained it, because this way of writing has no beauty and no box office. However, I wanted to persist. In the beginning, I persisted in writing it this way because of a very simple reason. Before I wrote about the year of Qingyu, I was wondering what kind of strange existence an adult soul would become in a baby's body. However, I wasn't writing about strange things, so I could only use some minor details to remind everyone that the slightly bashful smile was an important part. If a 20-year-old wanted to pretend to be an innocent and ignorant baby, how should he smile? How should he giggle? I have observed many children and found that there is one type of smile that is most common, and that is the slightly bashful smile. Fan Xian pretended to be slightly bashful for a long time, so when he grew up in the world of the Qing Kingdom, he inevitably developed this kind of habit. This was something that I thought was necessary to make up his expression. It was a very powerful detail, but unfortunately, it was interpreted in a different direction. I really wanted to shout, How serious am I? I'm a pearl, dust go away. I shrugged. However, everyone knows that I was criticized badly, so I didn't persist with the bashful smile. There was no way around it. I wanted to eat. I was dissatisfied with myself for not being able to stick to my structure and description, but to be able to find an opportunity to explain it to everyone was something that I was very happy about. These two chapters confirmed Fan Xian's heart. In the future, he would not write about this content. He would only do it There are tombs in the Vermilion Bird story, and there are also tombs in the year of Qingyu, because these are all very important things. Recently, I haven't written much, so I haven't written much. This chapter was written in advance and posted at a fixed time because I had things to do during the day. I don't ask for everyone's understanding because you guys are too bad, too bad. Of the 3,000 update votes, 300 were voted. Of the 6,000 update votes, more than 700 were voted. Of the 12,000 update votes, 1,500 were voted. I counted with my fingers. I earned an extra 150 a day, nearly 400, more than 700 yuan. Then I was furious. My classmates were clearly bullying me for only writing 5,000 words today. Of course, I could still write a few dozen more words at this time, but I won't succumb to your sugar-coated bullets. Actually, it's just that if I take the money for 6,000 words, I won't feel at ease. Today, I wrote 900 words just for the epilogue alone. Speaking of which, seeing everyone having fun, I was also very happy. I have been too emotional recently. Thank you all for having fun with me, and thank you all for supporting me with so many update votes. Chapter 655. Fan Xian had already expressed all the emotions he needed to express. What he should have felt, 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 and what he should have been determined had all become fresh cement in his mind. Additionally, his sister had also spoken of the true reason she had come to find him. Naturally, he would not stay around these large graves. A group of people quickly boarded the carriage and headed into Jingdou. In the carriage, he listened attentively to his sister's account of what had happened in the manor. His furrowed brows gradually relaxed because the matter was much simpler than he had imagined. It wasn't a big matter. The matter involved the Jingdou magistrate. It should have been a big matter. However, these struggles and conflicts in officialdom were not much in Fan Xian's eyes. They were just slightly troublesome problems. She came this morning. She only said she was here to visit the princess. According to Master Tongue, looking at her gaze, she probably still wants to find you, Fan Ruo said in a low voice. Sister-in-law has entered the palace. There is no one in charge in the manor. Additionally, she knows her identity is sensitive, so she came to find me. What is there to be sensitive about? Fan Xian raised his brows sensitively and said unnaturally. If I remember correctly, Sun Pin is not much older than Rugia. It is not too out of line for her to come to the manor to chat with you. I didn't mean it that way. Fan Ruo saw the uneasiness on her brother's face in a glance and smiled. However, Sun Jingxiu is holding a birthday banquet in 2 days. If he wants to invite you, he should personally send an invitation. No matter what, it would not be his unmarried daughter's turn to appear. Why would he send an invitation to me? Fan Xian smiled. He's afraid of me more than enough. I've ruined his reputation for a lifetime. Besides, he's just a third-level official. Even if he wants to do something big, he wouldn't bother me. He must have something to ask of you. Fan Ruo lowered her head and thought for a bit. I just don't know what troublesome matter it is. Fan Xian paused slightly. These few months, all of his attention had been placed in the direction of Dongyi. He had paid less attention to Jingdou. He didn't know what strange movements there were. However, the Four Seas were at peace, and the Qing Kingdom's politics were unusually stable. Why would someone jump out and make trouble? After thinking for a bit, he lifted the curtain and gave Mu Feng a meaningful glance. Mu Feng understood and rode closer to the carriage. He lowered his head to listen to Fan Xian's quiet instructions and nodded repeatedly. The group of carriages entered the capital, circled around the side alley of the main street in the south of the city, and quietly stopped at the corner gate. Fan Xian got out of the car with his sister and looked around. Like a thief, he snuck in. After entering the garden, he was not in a hurry to go to the side hall to see the young lady of the Sun family. Instead, he made a shushing gesture and hid in the number 3 quiet study. Fan Ruo looked at him in astonishment. She thought that along the way in the carriage, it was clear that her brother was very concerned about the Jingdou government's matters. Sun Pinner was clearly in the side hall. He could have just gone and asked directly. Why was he hiding here? Fan Xian looked at his sister's expression and smiled self-mockingly. After all, she is an unmarried girl. It is truly inconvenient for me to openly see her. Fan Revo spat out a laugh and said, "You're afraid of that? If you really knew there were differences between men and women, you wouldn't have hidden in a young lady's boudoir for a few days 3 years ago." After these words were said, her face couldn't help but redden. Blinking, she glanced at her brother and giggled. Not only me, but even Cece was later very curious. "How exactly did you sleep in a young lady's boudoir those nights?" Fancian did not laugh or get angry. He only sighed helplessly and said, "It is already my fault for a girl as clean as ice and as clean as jade to be troubled by these rumors. Each time I think of it, I feel guilty. Yet, you still use this to make fun of me. It's truly not kind." Fan Ruro respected her brother the most. Hearing these words, she quickly became silent. However, the curiosity in her heart could not be erased. During the Jingdo Rebellion 3 years ago, Fan Xian hid in the boudoir of the Jingdo government. He secretly used the Jingdo government's procedures to arrange for the Black Knights to enter the capital and make preparations for his future comeback. At the same time, he subdued the Jingdo government. This was the most talked about legend in Jingdo these years. Many people were guessing at the relationship between Sir Fan Jr. and the young lady of the Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu's family. Why was that young lady willing to take such a big risk and betray her father to help Fan Xian? Why did Sir Fan Jr. strongly protect Sun Jingxiu afterward? Only remember his merit and not his grudge. Help him secure his position as the Jingdo magistrate, and not be implicated in the rebellion. Even Fan Xian didn't know how the story of those few nights had spread to everyone. He was worried that it would affect Sun Pin Er's reputation and bring this girl too much trouble. When the rumors were at their worst, he was slightly angry and had the Overwatch Council investigate. Who knew that, in the end, they would find a serving girl in the Jingdo government? Since the rumors had accidentally leaked in her garden, Fan Xian had no way of dealing with it. He could only pay special attention to his relationship with the Jingdo government. During these 3 years, there had been no communication at all. Even the Jingdo magistrate, Sir Sun Jingxiu, probably knew what Fan Xian was thinking and was deeply moved. Other than official business, he didn't even send a name card to the Fan Manor. After staying in the study for a while, Mu Feng led his uncle, Mu Tai, in. When Fan Ro heard the knock on the door, she had already hidden into the back room. Fan Xian looked at the sweaty face of the head of the first bureau, Mu Tai. Looking at his dark face, he couldn't resist saying, "Although I am in Dongyi, if there's any major movement in the capital, you have to quickly let me know." Mu Tai had already learned from his nephew that Fan Xian wanted to ask about the Jingdo magistrate's matter. He had already made preparations, but he heard the faint displeasure in Fan Xian's tone. His throat couldn't help but become dry. He didn't argue anything and directly placed the already organized files on Fan Xian's table. Fan Xian picked up the files and looked through them one by one. His brows gradually furrowed. A moment later, he sighed. During the few months he had devoted himself to Dongyi, there had indeed been some movement in the capital. Not only Sun Jingxiu, but the lives of a few other officials had also been wretched. The Ministry of Revenue and the Ministry of Appointments began to secretly investigate these officials. As for the specific matters to be investigated, there were all sorts of things. Having been in the Overwatch Council for a long time, Fan Xian knew that no yamen could be completely pure. As long as they investigated hard, no matter what the reason was, they would always find some problems. The Jingdo government was being investigated in secret by a few departments. It was beginning to bear an unbearable pressure. As the saying went, a storm was brewing. It would probably not be able to hold out much longer. The officialdom was the most sensitive. The civil and martial officials had caught wind of it. Even if they didn't add insult to injury, they began to look at it coldly. No wonder Sun Jingxiu had suddenly thought of holding a birthday banquet. He probably still hadn't figured out the palace's intentions. Was it a routine investigation, or was they preparing to use this matter to have him resign? Holding a birthday banquet could clearly see the palace's attitude. Fan Xian shook his head. He thought to himself that this magistrate did things seriously and righteously. Even if he had stood on the wrong side during the Jingdo Rebellion, it had only been a technical error. It was this kind of personality that made the emperor tolerate him for another 3 years. It was also this kind of personality that made him unable to see just what the palace wanted to do. He still had the delusion that he could continue sitting in the important position of the Jingdo magistrate. Fan Xian saw at a glance the deep reason for the storm in the officialdom. The officials, including Sun Jingxiu, were all not very clean. Although Sun Jingxiu had performed a great service in the end, at the beginning he had stood against the emperor's final edict. Those officials had not stood too firmly during the Jingdo rebellion and were suspected of being opportunists. The emperor was settling accounts after autumn. 3 years was not too late. Given the emperor's sinister personality, how could he let go of these despicable officials who had wavered in the past? Mutai saw that he was lost in thought. He swallowed and moistened his throat. Carefully, he reminded him, the limelight began with the Ministry of Revenue and the Ministry of Appointments investigation. It was definitely something that the Hall of Governmental Affairs agreed to do. This was a reminder to the commissioner that changing the Jingdo magistrate might have come from the palace. It was a reminder to Fan Xian not to clash with the emperor's intentions for the sake of a young lady of the Sun family. Fan Xian smiled. He had no interest in falling out with the emperor at a time like this. Furthermore, it was not worth it to fall out just for the position of Jingdo magistrate. Even if the emperor wanted to force Sun Jingxiu off the stage, he would not go so far as to kill him. Since it was so, he would let the emperor vent his resentment that had not been completely vented. Suddenly, his heart jumped. He remembered that the emperor had once promised him to keep Sun Jingxiu safe. He shouldn't go back on his word so quickly. Even if he wanted to go back on his word, he would have to look at his face. It was impossible for him to have the Hall of Governmental Affairs appear. He furrowed his brows and asked, "Has who the scholar said anything about this matter?" Presently, who the scholar was the leader of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. If the emperor truly wanted to use the Hall of Governmental Affairs to make this arrangement, then the Hall of Governmental Affairs' inclination should have come from who the scholar's lips. No. Mutai glanced at him and said, however, that He Zhongwei once said something after drinking, and the pressure on the Jingdo government increased. Everyone in the Overwatch Council, including the people in the Fan Manor, knew that Fan Xian greatly disliked He Zhongwei of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Thus, no one dared to show any admiration, respect, or any other positive emotional evaluation of He Zhongwei in front of Fan Xian. Fan Xian laughed coldly and said, after saying something after drinking, he made the Jingdo magistrate lose his appetite. This, sir, he is quite impressive. Although he said this, he understood that given the emperor's recent trust in He Zhongwei was only using his mouth to announce the emperor's intentions. If Sun Jingxiu knew what was good for him, he would have long asked to resign. However, it was clear that this Jingdo magistrate was not a clever person and did not realize this. Fan Xian thought deeply for a long time and then said, I know about this matter. Mutai glanced at him and did not tidy up the files on the table. He only said, even if you want to go to the Sun Manor, you only need to remind him. There is no need to do anything else. I know. You talk too much. Fan Xian waved his hand angrily and had the uncle and nephew leave. Before Fan Ruo came, another servant came to report that Yang Wanli had arrived. Fan Xian's spirits rose. He thought of how this bastard was doing very well in the Ministry of Works Yamen and had devoted his heart to political affairs. It had been a long time since he had come to pay his respects. How could he be free today? Fan Xian was very happy and quickly had someone invite him to the back of the manor. Unexpectedly, when Yang Wanli entered the study, his dark face was full of grievance. Yang Wanli was already the vice director of the river department of the Ministry of Works and a proper official in charge. Given this speed, it was certain that he would become a minister within 10 years. However, it was not entirely because Fan Xian was supporting him from behind. This official had experienced the tempering of the harsh sun on the Jiangnan dikes. He was no longer the pedantic scholar of the past who only knew how to talk about saving the country. Instead, he was a proper and capable official, which was why he had risen so quickly in the Ministry of Works. Thus, Fan Xian was surprised to see his expression today. The two of them said something in low voices. Fan Xian's expression became uglier and uglier. In the end, he only said a few comforting words in a low voice and had him leave. Yang Wanli rarely came to the manor to visit. Fan Xian secretly knew that he did indeed spend every day in the yamen, so he did not find it strange. On the contrary, he purposely helped him save time. After Yang Wanli left, Fan Ro walked out from the back room. Furrowing her brows slightly, she said, "What is it now?" Fan Xian's expression was heavy. He thought for a moment and then replied, "It's around the same time as Sun Jingxiu's matter. He Zhongwei is becoming more and more arrogant. Whoever I want to protect, he extends his hand to." Fan Ro listened quietly. Only now did she know that Yang Wanli's life in the Ministry of Works Yamen had not been very smooth recently. The Ministry of Revenue was also checking accounts in the Ministry of Works Yamen. The focus was on the Metropolitan Water Bureau he was in charge of. There was even the shadow of the Supreme Court and Ministry of Appointments behind it. Every year, Yang Wanli had Fan Xian silver to support him and lived well. He was also not a corrupt official. With internal and external factors added together, the accounts that passed through his hands were clear. No matter how the Ministry of Revenue investigated, they could not find any problems. Even when the Ministry of Appointments privately asked him to question him and raised doubts about his manner and the number of female servants, they were blocked by Yang Wanli with the excuse that it was a gift from his teacher. The officials of the Ministry of Appointments did not have the courage to go to the Fan Manor and ask Fan Xian for confirmation. However, on Yang Wanli's side, in the end, some small details were caught. The reason was actually related to Fan Xian. This matter had to start a few years ago. In the 2 years after the river burst its banks, Fan Xian was in charge of the palace treasury. Using his own methods, his father's help, as well as Xiam Mingji and Fan Xi's routes in the north, he had scooped up a great deal of silver from the palace treasury. After a few twists and turns, he had sent it to the River Transport Governor's Yamen at the time. At that time, Yang Wanli was still working in the River Transport Governor's Yamen. This large sum of silver, which made countless people tremble in fear, was in his hands. There were always some carelessness in the operation of the silver, and people had something to use against him. In particular, the officials of the Ministry of Appointments faintly raised questions about where the silver had come from. If this problem were to be investigated further, it was likely that many people would die. But where did the question come from? The corners of Fan Xian's mouth twitched slightly. He laughed coldly and scolded. "The silver was dug out from my savings. The emperor knows this, yet he still came to investigate. He is truly generous and virtuous." He glanced at his sister and sighed. Even the Ministry of Revenue is interfering. It looks like it will be difficult for the Fan family to control the Ministry of Revenue. In a society with imperial power, Fan Xian, as an official, was shamelessly boasting about controlling the Ministry of Revenue. It was truly a rebellious complaint. However, what he said was not wrong. Back then, regardless of whether his father was an assistant minister or a minister of the Ministry of Revenue, the entire Ministry of Revenue had been organized into a solid block. Regardless of whether it was the Crown Prince or the Second Prince, they had no way of extending their hands in. Even that spring day, when the emperor wanted to use the Ministry of Revenue matter to stir up some trouble, he had been blocked by Fan Jian. Back then, the Ministry of Revenue was the legendary independent kingdom, right? If it was at that time, who in the Ministry of Revenue would dare to investigate the Jingdo government and Yang Wanli, a student of Fan Xian school? Even if they couldn't stop the higher-ups from investigating, they would probably have secretly informed Fan Xian. However, following Fan Jian's sad retirement, the emperor slowly inserted officials into the Ministry of Revenue and transferred officials. The present Ministry of Revenue was no longer the Ministry of Revenue of the past. Each time Fan Xian thought of this, he felt angry on behalf of his father, although this anger was unreasonable. After Fan Xian brought up the name He Zhongwei, Fan Ro fell silent. Her face was slightly awkward and self-blaming. Fan Xian glanced at his sister and was silent for a moment. He then said, "Don't think too much. His own way alone would not dare to act against my people. This must be the palace's intention. Of course. Fan Xian lowered his head and continued. Looks like this popular, sir. He has also given up on the idea of a marriage alliance with our family and currying favor with me. He has decided to follow the emperor's wishes and be a loyal dog. He huffed coldly and said, His own way knows that the emperor has raised him up to fight against me and that he will only die a horrible death, but he has no choice. Since it is so, he hopes to be able to truly find the big problem between me and the emperor. He incessantly stimulated me, hoping that I would truly capsize. Only then would he be able to preserve his life. Why does the emperor want to do this? This was the greatest unease and confusion in Fan Ruo's heart. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said self-mockingly, The emperor has already decided for me to take over the position of director of the Overwatch Council in a few days. This was something that happened naturally. Fan Ruo did not congratulate him. On the contrary, the confusion in her heart grew stronger and stronger. Since the emperor's favor was the same as before, why did the emperor choose to suppress her brother's power at this time? Give a carrot, and you have to hit it with a stick. The emperor is always careful of his limits. This is to remind me and, in reality, to weaken me. He doesn't want to see an official with too much power in his hands. Fan Xian looked at his sister and suddenly furrowed his brows. With slight mockery, he said, Most importantly, the situation before us is the one the emperor has arranged for the future of the Qin kingdom. The Hall of Governmental Affairs is the center, with the scholar leading the court. Below, the Overwatch Council and Imperial Censorate check and balance each other. The Overwatch Council has hundreds of officials. Only by doing this can the peace of the court be ensured. He is beginning to test the effects and see what his Qin kingdom will be like 100 years from now. But his own way is also in the Hall of Governmental Affairs, Fan Ruo asked with confusion. This is because the power of the Overwatch Council is too great. In the past, it was Chun Pingping. Of all the civil and military officials in court, including my father-in-law, who could suppress him? Later, it was me. Just based on his own way's identity, as the imperial censorate of the left and the emperor's favor, it was impossible for him to oppose me, Fan Xian said. Thus, the emperor had no choice but to have his own way enter the Hall of Governmental Affairs and forcefully raise his rank. Now he is helping his own way cut my shoulders. Of course, if his own way's power in court truly grows, the emperor will certainly help me cut him down, Fan Xian said with a smile. What *T emperor schemes in the way of balance? It's all just eating too much and having nothing better to do. Fan Ruo was silent for a long time. She then said, But the young lady of the Sun family is still in the side hall. Hearing this, she understood that the situation with the Jingdo magistrate was indeed urgent. However, she had heard her brother say that this was the emperor's arrangement. She had never thought that Fan Xian would be able to help the Sun family. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian was silent for a long time and then said, Go tell Sun Pinner that I will go the day after tomorrow. Fan Ruo was startled and said, Didn't you say earlier that this was the emperor's intention? Fan Xian lowered his head and crossed his hands calmly in front of his abdomen. The emperor and I had a tacit understanding 3 years ago. If it had been before, if the emperor wanted to cut my power, I would have let him cut it. So what if I let his own way be arrogant for a while? But not now. He raised his head and smiled. I don't know what will happen in the future, so I have to ensure that I can still hold enough power now. You want to fight the emperor? Fan Ruo's eyes were wide open as she asked with unease and shock. I'm still a young man. It is always allowed to have some anger in my heart. Fan Xian smiled slightly. His smile was fresh and cheerful. There was not a trace of anger to be seen. His thoughts were actually very simple. Presently, he had to protect everyone he wanted to protect. He had to temporarily maintain the power in his hands under the pretext of being angry. Only then could he learn to face the powerful emperor head-on. Fan Ruo was silent for a long time. She knew that her brother had made up his mind and didn't say anything more. She just couldn't resist smiling and asking, Are you really not going to keep the young lady of the Sun family company and talk? I'm very afraid that she won't be able to marry in the future. It's better not to see her, Fan Xian said helplessly. Just tell her that I am looking forward to the birthday banquet the day after tomorrow. I didn't think that while I was having so much fun yesterday, I would still stir up some trouble. It's a bit of headache. However, I really don't have much energy, so I'm too lazy to argue. Relaxing and having fun is the right way, right? The title of today's chapter is the name of a variety show. Who has seen it? Haha. Let's talk about the last few sentences of the month. Dear leaders and comrades, we've been following that lewd old man for a whole month. Whether it's speeding up a few steps and catching up with him to intercept him, or following him intimately, we've scared him so much that his little heart is pounding. We're waiting for today. We're waiting for today. Chapter 656. I also know that these words aren't as awesome as I said a few days ago. It's mainly because of Liang Hechuan's influence. Monthly votes aren't AC Nielsen's ratings, but they're even more evil than ratings. On one hand, it's the most direct ranking, and on the other hand, it's the most direct money. In any case, I have to pull one last vote. Who knows what you bad people who only voted 3,000 words today will come up with. In short, the monthly ticket is evil, but it's also my favorite. You, that's you. Don't turn your head to look at other people in the internet cafe, and don't look at your wife who is playing Fight the Landlord on her laptop. That's you. Put down the evil monthly ticket that people love and hate. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for your hard work and support this month. Chapter 657. Sun Pin sat uneasily in the side hall. She sat very properly and wore a blue robe. She was so fresh and elegant that she did not seem like a guest. She was overly cautious. In the morning, she had already come to the Fan Manor. Her mind had long become a mess. For a moment, she was angry and embarrassed that she, a girl, had come to the manor without any shame to ask for an audience. For a moment, she thought of her father sighing and sighing at home. She was very worried. In the corner of her heart, the most frantic part was occupied by Fan Xian's appearance. It had been 3 years since she had seen Sir Fan Jr. Although the serving girls often heard rumors from outside and talked about it in the room, Sun Pinna knew that he had lived well these 3 years. He had a son and a daughter, and his family was harmonious. There were also no problems in court. Her heart was comforted to the extreme. Sun Pinna wanted to see Fan Xian, but she knew that if she actually saw Sir Fan Jr., it would be very inappropriate. For a moment, she could not cut it off or sort it out. She hoped that he would take the time to summon her, but she also hoped that he was not in the manor and that she could go back quietly. The tea on the long table was slightly cold. Another serving girl came up to change it. This was already the 4th cup of tea. From sitting in the morning until now, the Fan Manor had not treated the young lady of the Sun family coldly. After the Tung family returned from the medical shop, they began to chat with her respectfully and calmly. After talking for a number of hours, the words from the woman's mouth did not repeat anything. Sun Pinna knew that this woman was the housekeeper of the Fan Manor and did not treat her lightly. Hearing that Princess Chun was not in the manor, she let out a breath in her heart. Everyone knew that the princess of the Duke's Manor was the most gentle and amiable. She never expressed any opinion on matters of the outside world. She only did her best to host the Hangzhou Conference and seek benefits for the poor people of the Qing Kingdom. Her benevolent heart was greatly admired by everyone. However, Sun Pin knew the rumors in the capital, so she was always afraid. After waiting for a long time, the Tung family only said that Junju had gone to the palace and the Duke had gone on an errand and wasn't in the Fu. They didn't have a host to entertain them and asked Miss Sun to be understanding. Sun Pinner had already seen with her sharp eyes that there were officials coming in and out of the garden. She had already guessed that Sir Fan Jr. was probably hiding in the back garden and unwilling to see her. Slightly disappointed, she was about to rise to say goodbye. Unexpectedly, the Tung family refused to continue her conversation. Sun Pinner was slightly shocked. She guessed that the people in the back garden were probably discussing something about her arrival, so she calmly sat down. Before long, Fan Ro walked into the side hall. Sun Pinner quickly rose and bowed. The two women looked at each other and said something in soft and warm words. Fan Ro then quietly repeated what Fan Xian had told her. Sun Pinner's heart was filled with joy. She thought that if Sir Fan Jr. was willing to come the day after tomorrow, it would be wonderful. She quickly expressed her thanks, exchanged a few more polite words, and was about to leave. Fan Ruo saw clearly the girl's joy and faint melancholy and couldn't help but sigh in her heart. She thought that her brother really had too many emotional debts. She couldn't resist saying quietly, "My brother is in the back garden." However, there are differences between men and women, so it is not convenient for him to come out and meet. Please understand his painstaking efforts. Sun Pinner's body shook. She sensed some other meaning from the sudden addition of these words from the young lady of the Fan family. It seemed that she had faintly grasped Sir Fan Jr.'s difficulties and tenderness toward her. Her cheeks blushed slightly. Her heart was filled with endless gratitude. She bowed deeply and left. Fan Ro looked at the girl's back and couldn't resist laughing bitterly. She turned her head and saw Fan Xian's furtive appearance. She smiled and said, "She's already gone. What are you looking at?" She paused and then said, "But she understood your meaning." It looked like she was very grateful. Speaking of this, she couldn't resist a rare glare at Fan Xian and said, Can you not be so careful? You seem to be thinking for Miss Sun, but who knows how deeply you've sunk her." Only after these words were spoken did Ruo realize that her words seemed to reveal a sense of darkness. Her heart jumped, and she quickly hid it with a smile. "There is something I forgot to tell you. We all misheard earlier." Fan Xian didn't pay attention to these words. He only smiled bitterly and sighed. When did being a good person become a bad thing? After successfully avoiding the young lady of the Sun family and comforting his sister, Fan Xian became idle again. Crossing his legs, he read the letters from Shi Chanli and Su Wenmao as he quietly hummed something. The diplomatic group in Dongyi was still dawdling. Sigu Jian estimated that they could hold out for another 2 days. He was not in a rush. It would be fine to stay another 6 or 7 days in Jingdou. It had been a long time since he had carefully dealt with his personal affairs. It was perfect for him to put some effort into it. Su Wenmao's position in the 3 large workshops of the palace treasury in North Min was becoming more and more stable. If the emperor sent down an edict, he estimated that at most 20 to 30% of the people in the Overwatch Council would stand firmly behind Fan Xian. That lump of ice will probably stand in the middle. He will certainly not disobey the edict, but he shouldn't act against me either. Fan Xian silently thought about whether or not his friendship with Yan Bingyun would be able to stand the test of time in the future. Immediately after, he thought to himself, in the entire Overwatch Council of the 1st Bureau, 3rd Bureau, and 4th Bureau, his control was the strongest. The only people who could truly follow him through mountains of knives and seas of fire were the people of the Qinian unit. Fan Xian had begun to tamper with the palace treasury a few years ago. He believed that if the situation changed in the future, he would certainly have a way to make a powerful response. The palace treasury was a divine weapon that Fan Xian could use to fight against the might of heaven. Shi Chanli and Su Wenmao's loyalty was definitely trustworthy. Additionally, there was Deng Ziyu, who was now in Shiliang. Fan Xian suddenly realized that the power in his hands was indeed very strong. Furthermore, there were faint signs that it was about to break away from the emperor's control. No wonder the emperor had begun to experiment with the future arrangements of court politics. A glimmer of a smile rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. He thought that, in the end, the emperor still had not discovered the most important point. He would go fight him the day after tomorrow and confirm and protect the power in his hands. He should be able to hold out for a few more years. Just as he and Haidang had once said, this world was those old people's and also theirs. In the end, it would always be theirs. All they needed was time. One day at the end of April, the spring flowers had not been destroyed by the heat and wind. Instead, they were scattered to the ground by a sudden spring rain. The flowering trees that stretched out from the courtyards on the long streets in the south of Jingdo watched helplessly as their clothes were torn into shreds by the seemingly gentle but actually merciless spring wind. They fell to the stone ground outside the courtyard walls and were stepped on by hurrying pedestrians. They sank deep into the mud, revealing only the pink edges. The manor of the Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, was on the main street in the south of the city. Not far behind this manor was the Jingdo Yamen. However, the hall of the Yamen was on the other side. The peace of power and wealth depended on each other but did not interfere with each other. Today was not Sun Jingxiu's birthday. Rather, it was his old mother's 80th birthday. It was indeed an important day. What Fan Ro said the day before yesterday was that she had misheard. The old matriarch of the Sun Manor was also someone with a title. Sun Jingxiu rarely did anything, so when the various invitations were sent out, the officials would always come and entertain him. Although there were no red ribbons and colored lanterns hanging outside the Sun Manor's door, they had purposely added a sense of celebration. There were many people coming and going with gifts, but not many carriages came. On the long street, the housekeepers and servants only delivered the gift lists and boxes into the manor, as usual. After saying a few words of apology on behalf of their masters, they left the Sun Manor. Some of the lower-ranking officials who did not know the inside story couldn't help but feel surprised when they saw this scene. They thought that the birthday of the Jingdo magistrate shouldn't be so deserted. It was a far cry from the bustling scene of the manors of other nobles. The Jingdo government was in charge of the safety of the entire Jingdo people. The people they dealt with were mostly the various yamens, various manors, nobles, and various officials. Thus, it was difficult for the Jingdo government to do their jobs. However, the Jingdo government status was also high. When the second prince fought for the throne, he had put a lot of effort into the Jingdo government. Normally speaking, no official would not give the Jingdo government face. Today's scene was indeed a little surprising. The people around the corner door were whispering among themselves. No one knew what they were discussing. However, they occasionally thought of the rumors of the Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, in officialdom, and felt that this was a natural thing. Sun Jingxiu was, without question, the luckiest person in the entire Qing officialdom. He was not a proper jiren. Rather, he was a scribe. From the moment he became an official, he had been doing administrative work in the Jingdo government. He had been doing this for half his life. Given his background and lack of background, in such an important place, even if he worked for 3 lifetimes, he probably wouldn't be able to rise to the position of Jingdo magistrate. However, during these 6 or 7 years in the Qing kingdom, the crown prince and second prince fought for the throne. After Sir Fan Jr. entered the capital, there were chaotic battles. The Jingdo government, which was in an important place, became the most important place for the various powers to fight over. The Jingdo magistrate was not like the governors of the various roads. The various magistrates were far away from the emperor, so they could protect themselves and not lean toward any prince. The government was in Jingdo, so no power would let them go. The Jingdo magistrate had to make his stance clear. Thus, Mei Zhili was forced away, and the Jingdo magistrate that the second prince had helped into power was forced down. In a short 5 or 6 years, a number of Jingdo magistrates had fallen. No official had the courage to forcefully ask for this position. Thus, Sun Jingxiu, the editor of the Jingdo government, coincidentally sat in the position of the Jingdo magistrate. In the past, the Jingdo magistrate also held the position of a scholar in court. However, after Mei Zhili, this rule became chaotic. By Sun Jingxiu's time, he was a bachelor Jingdo magistrate without any title of nobility. Thus, in officialdom, the officials all carried a glimmer of jealousy and disdain in their comments. Sun Jingxiu was the luckiest Jingdo magistrate in history, but he was also the Jingdo magistrate with the least power. Who knew when he would be kicked off the stage? However, Sun Jingxiu had his strong points. His long years of paperwork made him not good at interacting with officials. He was also not used to sucking up to the scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. He threw himself wholeheartedly into state affairs. His conduct was honest and serious. He never took the rumors outside to heart. It was this kind of personality that made him, who had not seen the so-called emperor's posthumous edict in the autumn of the 7th year of the Qin calendar, accept the Empress Dowager's edict and do his best to put Fan Xian on the wanted list in Jingdou. The affairs of the world were difficult to predict. Who knew that the emperor had not died? Who knew that Sir Fan Jr. was a loyal official? Each time he thought of this, Sun Jingxiu couldn't help but feel a lingering fear. It was fortunate that he had raised a good girl, which allowed him to find a backer in court for the first time. Furthermore, it was the highest backer in court. Thus, the officials became even more jealous. The rumors of him selling his daughter for glory spread for a long time before they finally died down under Fan Xian's powerful suppression. 3 years had passed. The officials found that the connection between the Fan Manor and the Jingdou government was not close. Only then did they believe that the legend in the boudoir was only a legend. There was no follow-up story. It was because they believed that Sir Fan Jr. and the Jingdou government did not have any relationship between a man and a woman that the front door of the Sun Manor appeared so cold and cheerless. It was even more cheerless than the flowering trees by the side of the street. The housekeepers from the various manors who had given their gifts left the Sun Manor but did not leave the south of the city. Instead, they cleverly chose a tea house at the end of the street to rest for the time being. It was not even noon yet, but this luxuriously decorated tea house was already bustling with noise and excitement. The stewards who were familiar with each other greeted each other with a smile and invited each other to sit in the middle of the table. In a short while, half of the tea house was filled. The smiles of the housekeepers were strange. They all revealed a tacit understanding and a faint disdain toward the Jingdou government. The masters of these housekeepers were either officials of the 6 ministries or officials of the 3 temples. Some were nobles from the Duke's Alley. Today, they only sent gifts, but they did not come in person. The fact that these housekeepers were gathered in the tea house and did not immediately return to the manor to report on the completion of the mission meant that these nobles and officials knew very well what the Sun Manor's birthday celebration represented. Sun Jingxiu was muddle-headed. This was the common thought of all the civil and military officials. Since Scholar He of the Hall of Governmental Affairs had already leaked the news, it was the person in the palace who had the idea. You still don't dare to immediately resign, yet you still want to hold a birthday celebration at this time? Do you want to see the palace's attitude? Do you want to see the rumors and officialdom? Or do you want to see something? However, these nobles and officials did not want to take things too far, so they had the housekeepers keep watch near the Sun Manor after they gave gifts. They didn't know what exactly would happen. More accurately speaking, they were still a bit afraid of whether the rumor that had been quiet for almost 2 years was true or not. They didn't know whether or not the Duke of Dambois would personally come. Logically speaking, given Fan Xian's identity, the Jingdou government's business should not disturb him. However, the officials were all cunning people, so they still needed to make a final confirmation. Whose family sedan share is that? A housekeeper who was talking about romance suddenly narrowed his eyes and saw a large sedan chair pass by the door of the Sun Manor. Looking at the number of people and the decorations on the curtains, it should not be of a low rank. The matter of the Jingdou magistrate changing was still in the rumor stage. All of the officials knew that this was the first time the popular He Zhongwei, with the emperor's support, had independently completed a highly influential personnel change. Thus, the officials of the various departments cleverly stood behind He Zhongwei. No one would stand in front of Sir He at this time. Today's birthday banquet was a good time to pick a side. Everyone wanted to get closer to the young and gentle Scholar He. Thus, the entrance to the Sun Manor was cold and cheerless. At this time, a rather eye-catching sedan stopped at the entrance to the Sun Manor. The housekeeper of the assistant minister of the Ministry of Appointments laughingly scolded, "It's probably some manor that doesn't participate in politics." The assistant minister of the Ministry of Appointments had a good relationship with He Zhongwei and knew the inside story of this matter. Thus, he had never thought of coming. Even this housekeeper's tone was slightly mocking. Unexpectedly, a housekeeper shook his head and said, "Something's not right. It looks like Duke Lu's manor." After these words were said, The housekeepers who had come from the Duke's alley to deliver gifts quickly walked to the side of the railing. They looked for a moment, and their expressions gradually changed. However, they didn't say anything to the people beside them. They met each other's eyes nervously. Taking advantage of the fact that the other housekeepers had not reacted, they sneakily slipped down the stairs. The other housekeepers in the tea house did not notice the commotion. They were just curious. Why would Duke Liu, who never participated in politics, lower himself to give the Sun family face? Immediately after, another large sedan chair slowly came from the north of the city and landed in front of the Sun Manor's door. From a distance, it could be seen that the Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, had just received the Duke into his manor. At this moment, he was crawling out again. He was so shocked that he was about to fall to the ground. A housekeeper in the tea house cried out in a sharp voice, "It's old Prince Jing." As soon as these words came out, a strange and quiet atmosphere enveloped the tea house that was previously very chaotic. All the stewards stopped talking and began to quickly calculate in their minds, trying to guess what this shocking scene in front of them meant. Some of the smarter people had already connected Duke Liu and King Jing, two noble figures who would never appear in the Jingdo government, to another important figure. Their faces suddenly became deathly white as they quietly went down the tea house. The remaining housekeepers were still staring nervously at the door of the Sun Manor. It was as if they did not believe their eyes. They did not believe that Sun Jingxiu, this lonely old man, would be able to invite these two people to come out and help him. At this moment, two unremarkable black carriages drove steadily along the streets in the south of the city. They drove past the tea house and stopped in front of the Sun Manor's door. The black carriages were unremarkable and eye-piercing. The faces of everyone in the tea house all paled as they watched the young Duke walk down from the carriage. Even more awkwardly, they watched the magnificently dressed princess slowly ascend the stairs with the Duke's support. In an instant, the tea house became incomparably quiet. All the stewards rushed downstairs at lightning speed and rushed back to their own mansions. They had to notify their masters. Sir Fan Jr. had come, Princess Chun had come, King Jing had come, Duke Liu had come. Who are you? Hurry and go. Even if the Duke of Dongbua only wanted to slap He Zhongwei's face, you still had to go and watch with a smile, no? For a moment, the manners of the officials in the south of Jingdo fell into chaos. Those who were looking for clothes looked for clothes, those who were sending messages sent messages, and those who were preparing new gifts prepared new gifts. But all the officials only had one goal, and that was the Sun residence. Most of the officials who had nothing to do with the matter faintly guessed why the little Duke was going to the Sun Manor. Other than shock in their hearts, they couldn't help but feel a little excited. Jingdo had been peaceful for too long. It would be a good show to see how Sir Fan Jr. bullied the scholar and the officials of the various departments. Chapter 658. Lin Chen, Best Female Lead. Fan Xian, Worst Male Lead. Me, Best Screenwriter. Thank you, everyone, for your hard work and support last month. I'm very happy. Thank you very much. I won't be pretentious at all. I'm really happy. Because I didn't write much, I still managed to get so many votes in the end. Everyone did a much better job than me. Lao has always been much more hardworking than me, so I'm already very happy to be ranked 4th. The difference isn't that big. It's all because of everyone's continuous support. Thank you very much. After I finished writing yesterday, I went straight to deliver food. Then, I almost forgot the shouting trick I learned from Liang Hechuan. I could only ask the leader from afar to do it. It felt good, it felt good. I still can't write too much in the first few days of this month. I'm really sorry. Of course, one day, I'll try to work harder. I still have to continue canvassing votes. Brothers and sisters who have guaranteed monthly votes, if you want to spend it, please hurry up and do it. Thank you very much. Then I thank myself because I know I'll work hard and seriously write my book this month, next month, this year, next year, and most likely for the rest of my life. Because I really like writing. Then, I turn back to thank everyone again because I'm definitely going to get the few hundred 3,000 word update votes yesterday. While laughing. Seriously speaking, I really don't want everyone to spend this money. In the past, I didn't think it was convenient to say it directly in the book, but today, I can't help but say it. Don't vote for the update votes. No matter how small a mosquito is, it's still meat. A dollar has its uses. The money I get from subscriptions is my legitimate income. The monthly votes reward is everyone's encouragement, and the update votes reward is something I don't feel good about. I'll continue writing. Everyone knows me. I can last. I don't need the temptation of the update votes, although I don't write much every day. If you vote for 12,000 but I can't write it, then I won't get it. If you vote for 3,000 but I write smoothly, then I might be able to write an entire 20,000 word chapter. I understand that everyone is encouraging me, but it's fine to save some money, right? Chapter 659. The Qing kingdom governed the world with filial piety. When the wise and brilliant emperor moved a large amount of silver from the national treasury to build a mausoleum for the dead Empress Dowager, the scholars Xu and who only expressed their worry on the surface. Fan Xian could not be bothered to pay attention to this matter. Sun Jingxiu was celebrating his mother's birthday, so it was much more important than his own. It was because of this matter that he had the courage to invite Fan Xian. When Sir Fan Jr. actually held Princess Qin's hand and stepped through the front door of the manor, Sun Jingxiu still found it difficult to suppress his excitement. His life these few months had been precarious. It seemed that in an instant, all of the officials and yamens had begun to watch him. It made him feel like there was a thorn in his back, and he could not rest easy. After thinking it over, he still thought it was Fan Xian. However, the Sun Manor and the Fan family did not actually have a deep connection, so he didn't know if it would work or not. It worked. Although Sun Jingxiu's lips tasted bitter and gloomy, and he felt a great deal of guilt toward his daughter, he looked at Fan Xian's handsome face and still bowed respectfully. He then welcomed the pair into the manor. The manor had long been properly arranged. All of the female guests were in the back garden. The people sitting in the front yard were all the main officials of the Jingdo government. The three halls, the front and back, that had been specially left open for the officials of the court, were currently empty and eye-piercing. Fan Xian followed Sun Jingxiu inside. Looking at the long, empty tables, he couldn't resist smiling. Lin Wan'er quietly said something by his ear. Accompanied by the nannies and carefully served by the women of the Sun Manor, she walked toward the back garden. Turning to the west wing, Fan Xian followed Sun Jingxiu into the study. He already knew that King Jing and Duke Lu had already arrived. The two noble elders were currently chatting with Sir Sun's mother. At their age and seniority, they didn't pay much attention to etiquette. The study was very quiet. Fan Xian looked at Sun Jingxiu and said with a smile, "Sir Sun, you are truly not a smart person." Before the banquet began, Sun Jingxiu was afraid of neglecting Sir Fan Jr., so he personally accompanied him into the study. The servants had not yet brought the tea, but Fan Xian had already said these words calmly and directly. Sun Jingxiu's heart involuntarily jumped. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. "I'm curious." Fan Xian looked at him and said in an even voice, "In the past, you never used these methods to figure out the emperor's heart. Why are you doing the opposite this year? Why do you want to borrow my power to see what's happening in officialdom? I am surprised that you're not a person who cares about power and wealth." Sun Jingxiu was silent for a moment. He then raised his hands in respect and said, "Jingxiu thinks that I have been rather particular in being the Jingdo magistrate. Please take pity on me." Fan Xian gently knocked on the table, as if he was thinking about the propriety of the situation. He had not expected Sun Jingxiu to make such a direct request. However, he also liked direct negotiations. A moment later, he nodded slightly and said, "I'll speak for you in the palace." "What about Lord He?" Sun Jingxiu was overjoyed, but he still maintained a calm expression as he asked in a trembling voice. Fan Xian lowered his eyelids slightly and said, "He is the imperial censor of the left. I can't control him." Sun Jingxiu was slightly shocked. Fan Xian raised his head and said with a slight smile, "However, he is only an advisor of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. If who the scholar doesn't nod his head, what can he do to you, the Jingdo magistrate?" The conversation in the study ended very quickly. Fan Xian did not have Sun Jingxiu spit out any mushy words in front of him. They both knew that since Fan Xian was willing to help Sun Jingxiu with such a large favor, Sun Jingxiu could only sell his life to Fan Xian. The Jingdou magistrate was not an idle position. When Sun Jingxiu glanced toward the officialdom, he could only see the back of Fan Xian's head. He had no other choice. Just as Fan Xian and Sun Jingxiu were chatting, the stewards and servants of the Sun Manor stared dumbfoundedly at the endless stream of official sedan chairs coming in from outside the manor. They looked at the famous people in court coming with smiles and warmth to offer birthday wishes. They couldn't help but wonder where these people had run off to earlier. A servant went into the study to notify him. Sun Jingxiu couldn't help smiling bitterly. He knew that the reason these people's attitudes had changed so quickly was all because Sir Fan Jr. had personally come. Furthermore, he had asked King Jing and Duke Lu to be the axes. Fan Xian saw the bitterness in his heart and said with a smile, "The matters of officialdom are just this shameless. You've endured in the Jingdou government for so long. You should get used to it. Otherwise, how many more years can you endure if you're always sulking?" Sun Jingxiu nodded his head in acknowledgement. There were only 3 tables set up in the main hall. The women were all arranged thoughtfully in the back garden. Fan Xian only followed Wanner to chat with Old Sun Matriarch for a bit before retreating. The main seat in the middle of the banquet was temporarily empty. Naturally, King Jing unceremoniously sat in the most honorable seat. High Duke Lu, on the other hand, sat diagonally across from him in the number 2 seat. The 2 elders had known each other their entire lives. Although they sat a little far from each other, their voices were loud when they spoke. It was as if a casual conversation had turned into an argument. As usual, King Jing's mouth was full of filthy language. With each sentence, he would bring in a few words. It made the officials at the 3 tables in the hall uncomfortable. Unfortunately, High Duke Lu was someone who had retired from the army, so he was familiar with this routine. Sun Jingxiu was entertaining the other officials. Fan Xian sat between King Jing and Duke Lu, smiling, chatting, and eating and drinking with them. He was at ease. King Jing and the Fan Manor were old friends, so their friendship did not need to be mentioned. Duke Lu was Lady Lu's biological father. On the surface, he was Fan Xian's maternal grandfather, so Fan Xian was incomparably respectful. He talked with Duke Lu about the matters in Danzhou. Lady Lu was doing very well. As a maternal grandfather, he was at ease. Additionally, with Fan Xian looking after them, the children and grandchildren in the Duke's Alley all had their own piece of land. Chatting with King Jing was a bit of a headache. This old man would vaguely bring up matters like the medical shop in just a few sentences. Fan Xian sighed quietly in his heart. He didn't know if there was a possibility between Hongsheng and Ruo. Speaking of Crown Prince Li Hongsheng, after the new year, as the general of Dingzhou, he could not always stay in Jingdou, fighting with the scholar. He had no choice but to return to the west. However, he left a group of personal guards outside the Damba medical shop to keep an eye on it day in and day out. The emperor knew he was messing around and was also very angry, but there was nothing he could do. The guests gradually all arrived. 3 ministers, 2 officials, 7 or 8 vice ministers, and more than half of the important officials in the Qing court had come. Given the Jingdou magistrate's reputation, he could not bring in so many important figures. However, Fan Xian's reputation had this kind of killing power. As time passed, Fan Xian began to have a headache. These ministers and vice ministers came to greet him. Naturally, he had to rise to greet them and accept their considerate greetings. Seeing that the 3 tables of people had come down, they were also a bit tired. However, this was not the end. There were still many officials in the outer courtyard who took turns coming in to greet him. They did not want to pass up this rare opportunity to see Sir Fan Jr. After one round, the entire hall floated with the sound of flattery. Fan Xian's expression changed several times as he was flattered by dozens of officials. The feeling of being flattered by dozens of officials was not a good one. After 3 rounds of drinking, another official began to mention Fan Xian's extraordinary service in Dongyi. Everyone's gazes looking at him became heated. At this moment, Not many people cared about the scholar his own way. After all, this little duke was the emperor's own son. Furthermore, he had done so much for the Qing kingdom these years. He was truly an extremely popular figure. What would the ruling class do? It was not impossible for him to split the land and be made a king. Fan Xian's head hurt. He wondered if these officials had come to wish the old matriarch of the Sun Manor a birthday, or had they come specially to flatter him. When all was said and done, he understood. If they had not come specially to flatter him, why would these officials come? It was clear that King Jing was also very interested in the Dongyu matter. He pulled him to his side and asked in detail about some confidential matters. However, it would take at least half a year to finish negotiating the treaty, so Fan Xian could not say anything. He only picked some unimportant matters and secretly told them to the old gardener. The low-ranking officials didn't have to care about fawning, but the ministers and vice-ministers sitting in the main hall still had to put on a calm expression. They only occasionally swept their gazes over Fan Xian's face. Fan Xian turned a blind eye to them. He knew these people were waiting for him to explode, and then they would see how he would deal with the subsequent matters. The sun gradually moved, and the noise of drinking outside also stopped. After drinking a few cups of wine, King Jing and High Duke Liu felt that their heads were a little heavy and their bodies were a little tired. They didn't want to see what was going to happen next, so they found an excuse to leave. Sun Jingxiu respectfully saw the two nobles out of the main door before returning to the main hall. After thinking for a moment, he ordered the servants to stand guard outside the main hall and pay attention to any activity. He stepped in and apologized to the officials at the 3 tables in the hall. He chuckled and chatted idly. After declining for a while, he finally sat back down in the main seat at the head of the table. The main hall gradually quieted down. Everyone unconsciously stopped and put down their cups. Looking at the various dishes in front of them, they used peaceful smiles on their faces to show their official manner and breadth of mind as they waited for what would happen next. First, Sun Jingxiu sincerely expressed his thanks, and so on. Then he also closed his mouth and sat by Fan Xian's side. He was very calm. Fan Xian's eyelids drooped slightly. He slowly put down the chopsticks in his hand. The ivory chopsticks landed on the green porcelain chopsticks pillow and made a light clinking sound. All of the officials' hearts were struck by this sound. There was an uncomfortable silence. The entire main hall was quiet. Compared to the liveliness in the courtyard and the music from the back garden, it was extremely quiet. I will not say more about Sir Sun's official reputation. Fan Xian raised his head and gently opened his thin lips. The emperor also has many words of praise and encouragement in private. Hearing these words, the officials at the banquet felt it was quite ironic. If the emperor truly liked this Jingdo magistrate, how could Sir he have let out that rumor? However, the duke said in private, who would know what the father and son said in private? Would these people at the banquet dare to ask something in front of the emperor's face? Everyone is an official in the same court. Everyone has times when things aren't going their way. I hope you can help each other out. Fan Xian's words were very lacking. First of all, he brought out Sun Jingxiu's predicament and put him at a disadvantage. Furthermore, he even brought out the words of helping a merchant. His table manners were a bit unsightly. However, things like standards always depended on the character. Even if the emperor wrote a limerick about a white dog swollen, the officials would still sing praises without restraint. After Fan Xian said this, all of the officials at the banquet stroked their beards and nodded. They deeply felt that Sir Fan Jr.'s words were simple, but not simple. They were very reasonable. Fan Xian turned his head and looked at the official to his right. What does Minister Wei think? The present Minister of Revenue, Wei Donghang, was a crafty official who had been polished for a long time in the Ministry of Revenue. In the past few years, he had gone to the Fan Manor to discuss matters with Minister Fan and had met Fan Xian countless times. For him to be able to take over Fan Jian's position was not only because of his performance in the Ministry of Revenue. More accurately, it was because he had completely fallen to the emperor's side. He wholeheartedly followed the emperor's wishes and pulled the Ministry of Revenue out of the swamp of the Fan family's independent kingdom. Minister Wei knew that his actions these 2 years had offended Sir Fan Jr. However, behind him was the emperor, so he was not too worried. During these 2 years, Fan Xian had not expressed any dissatisfaction toward him. It was as if he understood his difficulties. It was because of this that he knew of Fan Xian's arrival when the Sun Manor was hosting. After thinking for a long time, he still came. He had not expected that Sir Fan Jr. would actually choose to make things difficult for the Jingdo government and pick him first. His heart jumped slightly. He knew that Sir Fan Jr. did not like him. Otherwise, he would not have picked the Ministry of Revenue to be the first to attack. A faint coldness surged into his heart. However, Minister Wei had no other choice. After thinking for a moment, he smiled evenly and said, "What the Duke says is reasonable. The Ministry of Revenue acts according to the edict and Qing law. It would not act recklessly." Everyone at the banquet was a wily old fox who had risen and fallen in officialdom for a long time. They knew why Fan Xian had picked Minister Wei out to ask him alone. However, this matter did not concern them, so they had to let it go. They had not expected that Minister Wei's light words would push Fan Xian back. There was not even a vague promise of goodwill. The officials admired Minister Wei's courage. They were also worried about what would happen next. They all remained silent. The other two ministers raised their chopsticks and quietly indicated for the officials beside them to slowly eat. "I'm a very peaceful person." The smile on Fan Xian's face grew brighter and brighter. Staring into Wei Donghong's eyes, he said evenly, "If there's an edict, I will act according to it. If there is no edict, I would like to see what will happen to those lowly people in the end." The Overwatch Council and the affairs of the court were two different things. They did not interfere with each other. Fan Xian's words had already crossed a taboo. The words lowly people had, without a doubt, shaved Minister Wei's face clean off. His expression immediately became icy. Looking at Fan Xian, he said, "What do you mean by this?" Fan Xian still did not get angry. He only smiled and said, "Nothing. I am just going to the palace tonight to ask the emperor what edict he has recently given the Ministry of Revenue for the Ministry of Revenue Yamen to not do their proper work and instead wait in the Jingdo government every day. I control the Overwatch Council, but I do not dare to privately investigate third-level officials and above." Fan Xian's expression remained warm. Today is the old matriarch's 70th birthday, so I should not say such cold words that spoil the mood. However, I won't be able to stay in the capital for long. I am about to go to Dongi. I also thought that the Jingdo government is an important matter, so I was in too much of a rush. Everyone, please don't laugh. The officials at the banquet all laughed dryly. No one dared to actually laugh. Sir Fan Jr.'s words had clearly reminded them that he was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. In 3 days, he would officially become the second director of the Qing Kingdom's Overwatch Council. As for his other identities, there was no need to mention them. Return to Dongi? This was another reminder to the officials that Fan Xian had enough merit to ask the emperor for something, even if it was an edict. Minister Wei's heart jumped. He understood the meaning in these two sentences. Fan Xian raised a cup of wine and said to the officials at the banquet, "Everyone, let the Jingdo government be quieter." With these words, everyone knew that Fan Xian had officially stood out. After an awkward silence, people slowly raised the wine cups in front of them. It was uneven, but basically all of the officials raised their cups. Minister Wei was still staring at the wine cup in front of him in a daze. He was indeed in a difficult position. He knew that Fan Xian was a very vengeful person. Furthermore, he had smiled so warmly earlier. He was probably extremely angry in his heart. Even if he begged for mercy and took a step back, would Fan Xian let him go in the future? Furthermore, he was, after all, a minister of a court. His position was respectable, and he had the full support of the emperor in his own way. If he gave in like this, it would be difficult to justify. Fan Xian didn't look him in the eye. He smiled warmly and said, "Although we are all officials in court, we are all pitiful people. We all want to create a good future for our children, grandchildren, and relatives." The emperor once said that in life, one must have a heart of reverence. He looked at the people at the banquet and warmly said, As I walk between heaven and earth, I only have a heart of reverence for two things. The minister of the Board of Rites furrowed his brows slightly. He had been the first person to raise his cup earlier. He was different from Minister Wei. He had not offended the fan manor, so he had a chance to make amends. Furthermore, he silently mocked Wei Dongxing for not knowing what kind of person Sir Fan Jr. was and what tricks he had. He knew what Minister Wei was thinking. The Overwatch Council could not control officials above the third level. As long as the Emperor did not speak, it seemed that Sir Fan Jr. could not threaten him at all. However, he knew that Minister Wei seemed to have forgotten history. When Fan Xian was still a commoner, he had sent the original minister of the Board of Rites, Guayu, to his death. Later, he had destroyed countless ministers. This was a ruthless person who dared to force the crown prince to his death. Why would you, a mere minister, clash head-on with him? Thinking of this, the minister of the Board of Rites followed Fan Xian's words and asked with a smile, "What is your reverence for?" "I first salute the Emperor, and second salute my parents." Fan Xian gently spun the little wine cup between his fingers and smiled. The Emperor speaks well. Without a heart of reverence, one's actions will tend to be impetuous. In the past, my actions have been impetuous. Please, everyone, forgive me. There was another wave of laughter at the banquet. Everyone heard the meaning of these words clearly. Reverence? The Duke was clearly telling everyone that other than heaven and earth, parents, and the Emperor, in their reverence, they should not forget themselves. Impetuous? This Duke's actions were not only impetuous, they were sinister and ruthless. It was still that old saying. It was a very low-level threat. Because the person making the threat was too powerful, it appeared powerful. In particular, Fan Xian's earlier mention of children and relatives finally reminded some people that even if the Overwatch Council could not touch the ministers and vice ministers, it was an easy matter to send the rest of the people and their families to hell. This was a very arrogant, and impudent action. However, the Emperor favored and trusted Fan Xian. No one could change this reality. Wei Dongxing's expression gradually darkened. His fingers also began to tremble. He felt that Sir Fan Jr. was too unreasonable. Did he dare to act against his own family because of his own matters? Everyone knew that Fan Xian dared. Although Sir Fan Jr. had the title of an immortal poet, he had always walked the dark and ghostly path and was used to being unreasonable. In the end, Wei Dongxing slowly raised his wine cup and drained it in one gulp. He didn't know the taste of the wine. Fan Xian nodded and raised his wine cup again. He said one last thing, "Everyone, eat and drink well." He didn't know if the remaining officials, particularly the Minister of Revenue who had been openly threatened and disdained by Fan Xian, were in the mood to eat and drink well. In any case, Fan Xian was in a good mood. He left the Sun Manor early and didn't go home with Lin Wan'er. Instead, he sat in the black carriage and headed toward the north of the city. To the Imperial College, he ordered Mu Feng'er, who the scholar is not on duty today. He is giving a lecture in the Imperial College. Mu Feng'er made a sound of acknowledgement and didn't think about why he was in such a rush to see who the scholar. Fan Xian rubbed the slightly tightened space between his brows in the carriage. His actions in the Sun Manor were not appropriate, but he had to put on such an attitude. Such an attitude would immediately spread throughout Jingdou, so he had to be at the very front to deal with the follow-up matters. He was going to enter the palace at night. Before entering the palace, he had to see who the scholar. If he could convince this leading scholar, then he would have more confidence in challenging the Emperor. Chapter 660. The black carriage passed by the intersection of Donchuan. Fan Xian had just pulled back his gaze from his bookstore and medical shop. Turning his head, he saw the ancient, overflowing doors of the Imperial College. The Imperial College was a rather sparsely built group of buildings. There were no buildings such as yamen or halls facing the street, and there were no tall courtyard walls. Even the main gate had never been closed. The green trees inside poked out, and the sounds of reading could be heard everywhere. It was full of the quiet and peaceful atmosphere of Confucianism. Just as the Bureau of Military Affairs had once been called the Ministry of Military Affairs, The old Ministry of Military Affairs was still mixed in with the Ministry of War of the Six Ministries. The Qing Kingdom had played with a number of new policies over the past few decades, and they had changed the name of the Imperial College again and again. Tungwen Library, Institute of Education. Whatever was difficult to say, the emperor had randomly changed it. However, the scholars of the world were still used to calling this area the Imperial College. Later, the official documents of the court naturally acknowledged this. The scholars selected by each province, as well as the outstanding children pushed out by the manners of the nobility in Jingdo, were all gathered in this group of buildings to study classics, history, and the ways of governance. This was the highest school in the Qing Kingdom, so the teachers they invited were also the best of the best. For example, Sir Pan Ling, who had already become a master calligrapher in the palace, and Sung Wenxiang, the teacher of his own way, a scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. A few years ago, Shu the scholar had also been a professor at the Imperial College. Now, the #1 Chinese official in the court, Hu the scholar, also often came to the Imperial College to teach these scholars. With so many arrogant teachers, in addition to the special status of the Imperial College, the students inside already had a very good future. So, the students of the Imperial College could not help but be arrogant. Normal government offices did not want to interact with the Imperial College, and the Qing Kingdom's slightly more liberal style of learning made it even more difficult for normal officials to casually go in. They were very afraid of being interrogated by these students and then fleeing in a sorry state. However, Fan Xian had never had such worries. His relationship with the students of the Imperial College had always been good. Particularly after the 4th year of the Qing calendar, he held a position in the Imperial College and served as the assistant of the nominal head of the Imperial College. Later, Fan Xian's talent shocked the world, and he dragged a carriage full of Master Zhuang's books from northern Qi back to the Imperial College. His position in the Imperial College became incomparably high, and he was deeply respected by the students. The carriage quietly stopped at the gate of the Imperial College. An official had already come to receive them. Fan Xian got off the carriage and raised his head to look at the large door he hadn't seen in half a year. He smiled. This simple and unadorned door had actually been built later. It had forcefully rubbed in a bit of antiquity. Spending so much silver was actually because the Qing Kingdom always had a deep sense of inferiority when it came to learning, particularly in certain corners related to history. The sky suddenly began to rain. Although it was not heavy, the scattered raindrops fell on the dark wooden door of the Imperial College, making it particularly eye-catching. The mottled spots gradually became a blur, and the stone slabs on the ground were about to accumulate water. An official from the Qinian unit silently took out a robe from the carriage and wanted to help him put it on. Fan Xian shook his head. Although he liked to wear black robes and bring his closest subordinates in a triangular formation and move out like a ghost in Jingdo's quiet autumn night, he didn't want to appear too special and startle the hot-blooded and pure students. Mu Feng held up an umbrella and sent him through the gates of the Imperial College. It was already afternoon. The sun had already moved west. Now, it was covered by clouds and swept away by the dark rain. The light became even dimmer. The spacious courtyard was filled with a sense of seclusion. Walking forward under the green trees, he didn't see a single person. It was extremely empty and quiet. Thousands of Imperial College students were still in class. As a professor, Fan Xian counted clearly. However, he furrowed his brows and thought, why did the sound of reading stop so uniformly? Like a swarm of bees suddenly moving together, or like a mountain wind pouring into a narrow natural stone kettle. A buzzing sound suddenly rang out in the quiet courtyard of the Imperial College. The sound grew closer and louder. It was the sound of countless people talking and laughing mixed together. Class ended. Hundreds of young scholars walked out of the various courtyards of the Imperial College at the same time and walked to the wide path in the center. They were densely packed and squeezed together. A wave of fresh energy immediately filled the entire space. Some of the young people had forgotten to bring umbrellas. They cried out loudly and jumped on the wet stone pavement. Breaking through the layers of rain, they ran toward their own dorms. Most of the students were calm and unruffled in the midst of chaos. With calm smiles, they opened the umbrellas beside them. For a moment, the entire courtyard was filled with countless umbrellas of all different colors. However, there were no bright colors. Most of them were light green and gray. Thus, Fan Xian, who originally didn't want to stand out, became a strange plant in the sea of pale umbrellas because of the large black umbrella above his head. He immediately attracted everyone's attention. "Sir Fan Jr., teacher, sir." The students surrounded him in pleasant surprise and bowed to Fan Xian. Most of the students had only seen his appearance from a distance. Some had been fortunate enough to have followed him to edit Master Zhuang's classics and history books, so they shouted with particular strength. Fortunately, there was no congestion. These students probably knew that Fan Xian was busy with official business in court and had recently been busy with important matters in Dongyi. Thus, they all suppressed the joy in their hearts. After bowing and greeting him, they made way for the middle path. Fan Xian smiled and nodded in acknowledgement. He then chatted a bit with familiar students and teachers before raising his head to look at the color of the sky. He didn't dare tarry any longer. Excusing himself, he walked toward the depths of Jingxi Courtyard. Behind him and the Overwatch Council officials, the students of the Imperial College still found it difficult to suppress their excitement. They whispered curiously among themselves. They were all guessing why Sir Fan Jr. had come to the Imperial College today. Would the Emperor return Sir Fan Jr. to the Imperial College just because of the Dongyi matter? Would he be allowed to continue teaching? Fan Xian closed the black umbrella and placed it by the door. A stream of cool rainwater flowed down the tip of the umbrella and wrote a large character, drenching the tall wooden doorframe. Fan Xian accepted the towel the teacher handed him and carelessly wiped his slightly wet hair. He then entered the inner room and bowed to the scholar behind the desk. With a smile, he said, "I've come to see you." The scholar took off the glasses on his nose and looked at him suspiciously for a while before recognizing him. He smiled and said, "It's rare that I don't have to stay in the corner room today. I was just thinking about some peace and quiet. Can't you give me some time to relax?" Presently, the Hall of Governmental Affairs was headed by the scholar. The emperor was, after all, gradually getting older. His energy was not as great as when he was in his prime. Furthermore, the emperor seemed to have thought things through and had thrown many political matters to the Hall of Governmental Affairs. He no longer had to attend to everything personally. In this way, the power of the Hall of Governmental Affairs was greater, but its affairs were incredibly busy. Using the private words of some sharp-eyed officials, the present Hall of Governmental Affairs was gradually becoming the Prime Minister's manner of the past. The power in the hands of the head scholar, the scholar, also seemed to be moving closer and closer to that of the past Lin Ruofu. Fan Xian didn't believe this. Since the emperor had, with great difficulty, pulled his father-in-law off the stage, he would not allow another Lin Ruofu to appear. However, he also knew that the scholar worked hard on political matters all day and was indeed very tired. Smiling, he went forward and bowed again. "If it wasn't serious business, I wouldn't have come to bother you." The scholar had a good relationship with him. One reason was that in the debate between the old and the new, the two of them were on the same side. Both sides admired each other's temperament, so they had formed a good personal relationship. Another reason was that during the Jingdo Rebellion, the scholar had helped Fan Xian greatly. In the end, Fan Xian had been the first to save his life. "Speak." The scholar placed the glasses on the table with a light click. After a slight pause, he sighed and said, "For you to personally go, I don't think it will be a good thing." Fan Xian smiled and looked at the glasses on the table. He didn't immediately speak of his purpose of coming. Instead, he said, "Are these crystal glasses still useful?" Just like in the past, the scholar had a youthful appearance that did not match his age at all. However, Fan Xian knew that there was a small problem with the eyes of this head of civil officials. 2 years ago, they had occasionally talked about it, and Fan Xian had remembered it. He had the palace treasury ponder it for a long time. In the end, they had found a foreign crystal from Dongyi and made a pair of unique glasses for him. The scholar had always been grateful for this matter. Day and night, He worked on government affairs and examined memorials. If his eyes were not good, it would be a big problem. However, it was hand-ground, and there was no optometry machine. Fancian only knew that who the scholar had presbyopia. He didn't know how much help it would be. Very good, who the scholar said with a smile. Who the scholar smiled and said, fine, just based on this bespectacled boy's affection, I will do whatever you want. In any case, the little duke will not have me do anything stupid that goes against the law and goes against the edict. After these words were said, Fancian was speechless and almost broke into laughter. He thought that this scholar appeared righteous, but he was actually so cautious and cunning. The two of them knew that, given Fancian's abilities, if there was a problem he could not handle himself, it had to be a problem within the court. Who the scholar's words were extremely cunning. Fancian smiled and shook his head. Just as who the scholar thought that it would be difficult for him to speak and was stroking his beard to comfort himself, he suddenly narrowed his eyes and said, the Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, is a pretty good official. Who the scholar's fingers tightened and almost pulled out his beard. He coughed repeatedly. He truly had not expected Fancian to speak so directly. Concerning the position of the Jingdo magistrate, as the leader of the civil officials, he knew the cause of the current situation. However, the emperor was currently supporting He Zhongwei to the position, so as a scholar, he could only maintain his silence. He glanced at Fancian probingly and said, Sir Sun, was it not the Duke who personally suppressed the rumors back then? Fancian couldn't be bothered to beat around the bush with him. He directly sat down beside him and moved close to his ear. I have nothing to do with his daughter, but I do want to protect Sir Sunday. This is the emperor's intention. Who the scholar did not hold back on anything in front of him and directly brought up the emperor. Fancian smiled coldly and said, it is just that He Zhongwei is dancing there in a youthful and moving manner. What does that have to do with the emperor? Who the scholar smiled. He knew that in front of anyone, this kid would not admit that the problem with the Jingdo government was the emperor's intention. Otherwise, he would be openly challenging the emperor. Fancian continued, I only ask one thing. How exactly was Sun Jingxiu's performance these 3 years? This, who the scholar gently stroked his short beard. After a moment of silence, he said, above average for 2 years and average for 1 year. It was nothing more than average. The Jingdo government was indeed an important position. Thus, who the scholar firmly remembered the performance of the 3 years and blurted it out. Fancian laughed coldly and said, don't say these blind words. The scholar knows in his heart that the position of Jingdo magistrate is not for people. If you don't offend this manner, then you offend that department. Year after year, you fail every year. Back then, Meijili was at most average. Fancian rubbed his wrist and said, Sun Jingxiu had 2 years of being above average. He was already an extraordinary and capable official. Additionally, this person was not good at forming factions and cheating. For him to have such an evaluation is truly rare. Who the scholar was silent for a moment. In the end, he could not defeat his own conscience and principles. Gently, he nodded his head. He knew that the position of the Jingdo magistrate was difficult to handle. Sun Jingxiu was truly a rare subordinate. If he continued to be in charge of the Jingdo government, it would be much easier for him as a scholar to handle matters. If he is truly removed, who will replace him? Fancian said seriously, I have not come today for personal feelings or to fight. I just want to ask, does the scholar want to see the Jingdo government change through another 5 magistrates in the next 3 years, and in the end cause such a ruckus that no one will dare to come and even play the trick of eating coal and getting sick? Who the scholar sighed and said awkwardly, I also don't want Sir Sun to leave. However, I still don't understand why there would be rumors of this coming from the palace. He stared into Fancian's eyes and quietly asked, did you and that person quarrel again? In this world, the only person who dared to quarrel with the emperor was Fancian. Fancian smiled self-mockingly and said, it has nothing to do with quarreling. You should also see clearly that the emperor is using this matter to establish He Zhongwei's might. Not to mention that Sun Jingxiu is now my man. Even if he was an idiot, I would still protect him. Earlier, you said it was not personal feelings. Now, he is your man again. Who the scholar smiled bitterly and shook his head. What do you want me to do? If I appear, the emperor will certainly guess that I was asked by you. Sir, he is also a talented person. Why do you have to be angry at him? Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then quietly said, this anger must be dealt with. In this world, if the east wind does not overwhelm the west wind, then the west wind will overwhelm the east wind. I will not give his own way a glimmer of hope, a glimmer of possibility, a sliver of luck, or successful history. Why? Who the scholar saw the seriousness in his words and felt slightly startled. Fan Xian didn't answer this question because it involved him doing his best to hold on to the power in his hands under the emperor's pressure and make an announcement. He slowly stood and said, tonight, I am going to the palace to quarrel and force the emperor not to issue an edict. Thus, the Jingdo government's problem is the pressure of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. I need you to help me resist it. Who the scholar didn't reply. It was as if he was waiting for his explanation. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, Sun Jingxiu is a decent official. He shouldn't disappear in the senseless struggle for power. The reason is actually that simple. Without waiting for who the scholars speak, he faintly said, the Imperial College is a decent place. It is full of youthful energy. These students will all enter the court to become officials. As teachers, not only do we have to teach them something, we also have to use the true situation in court to help them build up some confidence. As long as an official is willing to do things, he will be safe and sound. Fan Xian stared into who the scholar's eyes. If Sun Jingxiu collapses like this, what will you teach these students? What use will the standards in the scholar's books have? Forced into a corner by Fan Xian, who the scholar was silent for a long time. He knew that this little duke was someone who would do what he said. If he didn't agree, he might actually use his prestige in the Imperial College to incite the students to do something. He couldn't help but sigh and say, fine, as long as the emperor does not issue an edict, I will protect Sir Sunday. Hearing these words, Fan Xian finally smiled happily and raised his hands in a salute. Without saying anything more, he bid farewell and left. Who the scholar picked up the crystal spectacles on the table and said with a smile, even if it's to return the favor for these spectacles, don't you think I'm returning the favor a bit too much? Fan Xian was in a good mood. At worst, I'll have the palace treasury make a few more pairs and give one to each of your young masters. Who the scholar was secretly mocked by him and laughingly scolded. What I mean is the governor said a few days ago that when you finish with the Dongi matter, you have to hurry back to the Imperial College to teach the students. Fan Xian smiled and replied, even if you didn't say this, I was prepared to do it. These were sincere words. Entering the Imperial College and seeing so many young students, Fan Xian was in a good mood. It was as if he thought of his previous life when he was in school. Furthermore, he knew that these students would certainly be the pillars of the Qing kingdom in the future. If he could influence them a little ahead of time, at some point, perhaps this would be his life-saving talisman. Fan Xian bid farewell and left. Who the scholar continued to do his own things alone under the dim company of a light. After an indeterminable amount of time, before the sky had completely darkened, an official quietly walked in and said something by his ear. Who the scholar was silent for a long time. A bitter smile rose involuntarily to the corners of his lips. In a quiet voice, he said, so, something like this happened at the Sun Manor banquet. I really don't know what this little duke is thinking to make such a pompous fuss. It is completely unlike his usual reserved personality. The official was who the scholar's trusted aide. There was also a puzzled expression on his face. He said with confusion, furthermore, this matter is very strange. He clearly knows that it is the palace's intention, yet Sir Fan Jr. is still stubbornly resisting it and even begging teacher. For mere Sun Jingxiu, is it worth it? It's not just Sun Jingxiu. Who the scholar sighed again and waved his hand for the official to leave. He warned, there's no need to bring this matter up again. As long as the emperor does not issue an edict, I will protect someone for Sir Fan Jr. It should be fine. The official acknowledged in a low voice and left after saying his goodbyes. The scholar's still young face changed expression under the dim light. He was thinking about Fan Xian's words earlier and guessing at Fan Xian's true intentions. East wind and west wind. He rubbed his slightly tightened brows and couldn't resist smiling bitterly. Sir, he probably did not have the right to be the east wind. Sir Fan Jr. was fighting the Emperor. But why was he fighting? Was it because he had a grudge against the Emperor's action of reducing power and was venting it here? The scholar sank into deep thought. He kept feeling that this was not the case. It had already been 3 years. The Emperor's reduction of the Overwatch Council's power had continued to advance. Fan Xian always took a step back before the palace took another step forward. He followed suit and retreated without a trace of unwillingness. Why didn't Fan Xian retreat? Was he worried that if he retreated too much, he wouldn't have anything in his hands to contend with others? Other than the Emperor, who did he need to contend with? The scholar's brows were furrowed tightly. He could not understand this matter no matter what. Suddenly, his fingers touched his wrinkles. Startled, he quickly and slowly used his fingers to spread them apart. Then, he quietly took out a small porcelain bottle from under the table. He picked out a small, oily substance from the bottle and carefully smeared it on his face. After slowly patting it, the skin on his face became smoother. The few wrinkles were not eye-catching at all. The scholar put the porcelain bottle into the table and hid it well. He smiled self-mockingly. There was no need for him to think so much about the matters between the Emperor and his son. It was not like they could truly turn hostile. Instead, it was his own face that made the self-mockery at the corners of the scholar's lips grow stronger. There was even a faint sorrow. He was not young, so he paid particular attention to the care of his face. He knew that his historical mission was to become the center of the Emperor's court in 100 years, so he had to not appear old. If His Majesty thought that he was already old, he would definitely have other ideas and leave a younger minister to assist his son. Everyone had their own secrets, their own helplessness, and their own sorrow. Yesterday's chapter was liked by many people. I was pleasantly surprised. Today's chapter is one that I've liked recently. I don't have any sense of anxiety when writing it. I'm very satisfied. At the beginning of the month, I summoned the monthly votes to everyone. Last month, everyone has worked hard. I will continue to trouble you this month. Come, vote for me. Chapter 661. 3 years ago, the entire Jingdo was hunting me down. If it weren't for the help of the Sun family, it would have been difficult for me to live until now, much less transport the Black Knights into the capital. The atmosphere in the royal study was tense. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and looked at the Emperor on the couch in front of him. His expression was slightly heavy as he slowly said each word. From this perspective, the Sun family could be considered my savior and a meritorious minister in quelling the rebellion. Quelling the rebellion? The Emperor did not raise his head. The dim yellow light shone on his tightly bound hair. A few strands of white hair could faintly be seen reflected. He only continued Fan Xian's words and coldly said, "If I remember correctly, that was the work of the young lady of the Sun family. What does it have to do with her father?" The young lady of the Sun family was always her father's child. Fan Xian raised his head and looked at the Emperor stubbornly and calmly. The Emperor put down the file in his hand and also raised his head. He looked calmly at his son and was silent for a long time. It was as if he wanted to see the true thoughts in the depths of his heart. A moment later, he quietly said, "You came to the palace today to say this?" "Yes, Your Majesty." The Emperor once again fell silent. After a long time, he suddenly said, "Why? I'm a person who always returns favors and grudges." The reason Fan Xian gave was simple. "I am greatly indebted to the young lady of the Sun family. If you only want to repay the favor." The Emperor said mockingly, "I gave Sun Pinner to you. Naturally, Sun Jingxiu's face will be bright. Why fight for this position?" Fan Xian did not smile in embarrassment. His face was incomparably calm, but his heart tightened slightly. Gritting his teeth, he said, through his teeth, "Because you promised me 3 years ago." The Emperor sank into silence. 3 years ago, Fan Xian had asked him for credit. Among them was the matter of Sun Jingxiu. He slowly opened his mouth and said, "What in this world never changes. The position of an official is the foundation of a country. How can it never change because of one word? Based on your words, if I promise you something, even if that person is corrupt and breaks the law in the future, I will still follow you and not touch him?" Fan Xian's earlier words carried a glimmer of anger and a glimmer of unbecoming ferocity. The emperor was angered by this intention of using his achievements to ask for rewards. In an instant, he calmed down. Perhaps the emperor liked Fan Xian's personality of putting everything on the table to argue. Sun Jingxiu is a capable official. Fan Xian did not take a step back. Looking at the emperor's face, he said in a clear voice, "If he dares to take bribes and bend the law, I will be the first to capture him and hack him to pieces." A strange light flashed through the emperor's eyes. It was as if he had not thought that Fan Xian would care so much about this matter. He faintly thought that it was probably because the method of reducing power had come too quickly and pierced this young man's heart. The Dongi matter was still being dealt with. The court had not truly rewarded Ji for his service, yet they were in a rush to arrange an opponent for him in court. No wonder Ji felt uncomfortable and forcefully pushed back. The emperor smiled slightly, thinking he understood Fan Xian's thoughts. He shook his head and didn't continue on the matter. A routine performance appraisal will always have to be done. The emperor lowered his head and said evenly. "Since you want to repay Sun Jingxiu's kindness in the past, I will not force you to be an unjust person. However, if he is not suitable to continue in this position, I will replace him." The emperor raised his head. It seemed to be a warning and also a reminder. Even if you're the director of the Overwatch Council, you cannot interfere too much with the matters of the court. The students of the Hall of Governmental Affairs work hard on court affairs. Don't interfere too much. Fan Xian didn't say anything more. He lowered his body in a bow and left the royal study. In these last two sentences, the emperor had already expressed very clearly that he would not personally interfere in this matter. However, his own way would still act against Sun Jingxiu. Furthermore, he reminded Fan Xian not to make any secret moves against his own way. Otherwise, the emperor would truly be angry. After Fan Xian left, the emperor glanced helplessly at the files on the table. A faint annoyance rose in his heart. With one hand, he pushed the files away and sat alone in the royal study. No one knew what he was thinking. Everything about Ji is good. It's just that his personality is too direct and stubborn. As the emperor thought to himself, he summoned Eunuch Yao in and asked him about what had happened in Jingdo. His expression gradually calmed. Hearing about the matter of the birthday banquet in Sun Manor, the emperor thought deeply for a long time. He understood why Fan Xian had jumped up like an old cat whose tail had been stepped on. An official who had just performed a great service was about to have his power reduced and his face swept away. Perhaps anyone would feel angry, let alone Fan Xian. Perhaps this matter was a bit too rushed, the emperor thought to himself. He did not want to admit that he had overlooked something. Coldly, he said to Eunuch Yao, "Tell his own way to do as he pleases. As for Ji, don't worry about it for now." The emperor had not thought that Fan Xian's anger was mostly faked. He only wanted to use his anger and sadness to force the emperor's heart to be moved and unable to bear to bully him. He wanted to keep the power in his hands for a while longer. Eunuch Yao respectfully responded. Immediately after, he lowered his voice and said, "That matter has been investigated to its end." The emperor made a sound of acknowledgement. A cold light flashed through his eyes as he said, "Speak." The dispatch order from the third workshop and the order for the city guarding crossbows to leave Northmen have both been obtained. However, when we finally found the transfer order from the Bureau of Military Affairs, it pointed to the Qin family. We couldn't see a shadow of that side, Eunuch Yao said in a trembling voice. The internal court had been secretly investigating the attack in the valley for the past year. The emperor had never let go of the suspicions from back then. He wholeheartedly wanted to capture that person and comfort Sir Fan Jr. To be able to do so many things without a sound and to have his hands and feet probed into the palace treasury was something that even the Qin family, once a member of the military, could not do. Furthermore, he did not leave behind any clues after the matter. In the entire Qin kingdom, other than the emperor himself, there were only the people of the Overwatch Council. The emperor's expression was complicated. He was a very vengeful and sensitive person. Presently, the situation under heaven could be anticipated. Although there were some small problems within the court, there was nothing that could threaten the foundation of the Li family's rule. Thus, the attack in the valley had become a thorn in his heart. Not only because someone had almost killed his son, but also because he had discovered that that person had faintly broken away from his control. Just like Fan Xian now, it seemed that he was also showing signs of breaking away from his control. As for Fan Xian, he could temporarily tolerate him because he was his own son, his most beloved son, and the son who had done the most for the Qin kingdom. As for that person had done even more for the Qin kingdom. Furthermore, the emperor still had not figured out the reason. He sat tiredly on the soft couch as if he didn't want to continue thinking about this matter. After a long silence, he said, "The investigation of the valley ends here. In any case, they are all people who are about to die. Have you found out the person behind the two eunuchs?" Eunuch Yao's temples burned with pain. He shook his head in fear. He knew who the two eunuchs the emperor was talking about were. This was another mystery behind the fog of the Qin kingdom. At the time, under the Empress Dowager's leadership, the entire Qin royal family was moving toward the crown prince's ascension. The second prince had also temporarily maintained peace with the crown prince. Coincidentally, two eunuchs jumped out of the palace with the intention of assassinating the third prince, Li Qingping. What exactly did they want to do? Furthermore, under the circumstances at the time, the third prince's life and death had no intrinsic effect on the crown prince's ascension. On the contrary, if the third prince had died tragically in the palace, it would have been an infamy that the crown prince and the second prince could not bear. Afterward, Fan Xian had investigated carefully, but the crown prince and the second prince did not admit to it. The eldest princess did not even talk about such a small matter before her death. Fan Xian could not continue investigating. He could only think that there were too many variables in the palace at that time. He didn't know what kind of conflict had exploded to put the third prince in danger. However, the emperor did not think this way. He never let go of any of the smallest oddities. That was why he was able to accomplish such a grand undertaking. Fan Xian walked out of the royal palace in the dark and ignored the eunuchs and serving girls who bowed humbly around him. He flicked his sleeves and left with a dark expression. When it came to his attitude towards servants, Fan Xian was definitely an anomaly in the Qin kingdom. Putting aside the servants and serving girls in the Fan manor, even toward the eunuchs and serving girls in the palace, his words were always gentle. Not only was he generous, but his attitude was also very different. It was as if he never thought there was anything to hate about these abnormal people. Because of this, the people in the royal palace all had a heartfelt respect and love for this little duke. Although Eunuch Ho, who had died to the arrows of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council 3 years ago, was someone the eldest princess had secretly planted, he was usually full of praise for Fan Xian. Fan Xian's unusual behavior fell into the eyes of many people. This behavior was very different from his usual behavior. These eunuchs and serving girls all felt a glimmer of strangeness. They all guessed that the little duke was probably arguing with the emperor in the royal study again. Walking out of the dark and secluded palace gate, Fan Xian stood on the square in front of the royal palace. He didn't turn his head to look at the palace gate. Instead, he spread his arms and let out a loud cry. It was as if he wanted to vent all the depression in his chest with this cry. His voice echoed through the silent and empty square. It crashed against the red wall of the royal palace and then turned back. It lingered for a long time without stopping. The guards inside the palace gate, the imperial soldiers outside, and the eunuchs who were about to drop the key all turned their gazes toward him. They were all startled by this voice. If it had been a normal person yelling like this at the palace gate, the imperial soldiers would probably have long rushed forward and given him a good beating. Then, They would be sent to the celestial prison to wait for the fall beheading for the crime of disturbing the palace. However, no one dared to move even after Fan Xian's random yell. There wasn't even a verbal reminder. Even if this person had gone crazy, if he was Fan Xian, then everyone would only beautify it as the madness of a poet and turn a blind eye to it. The person on duty at the palace gate was the commander of the imperial army, Gong Dian. He was the first official Fan Xian had seen after entering the capital. The two of them could be considered to be familiar. Hearing this cry, Gong Jian ran out from the duty room and hurried over. Dragging him back, he said, "What's wrong with you?" Fan Xian tidied the sleeves on his arm and smiled coldly. "I'm really about to go crazy." Although he said this, his expression had already calmed a great deal. Earlier, he indeed had some anger that needed to be vented. After enduring in this world until now, in front of everyone, Fan Xian no longer needed to hide anything or go against his nature. Other than the emperor, acting in front of the emperor was indeed very stressful. Furthermore, his emotions were very complicated. Looking at the emperor's thin and tired face, for some reason, Fan Xian thought of the portrait in the little building and the story from many years ago. A wave of blood and fire gathered in Fan Xian's eyes. He found it difficult to bear the feeling of being torn apart by these mixed feelings. Even though he was yelling in front of the palace gate, Fan Xian was actually acting. He knew that before long, this yell would be reported to the emperor's ears in the royal study. He wanted to act like a real person, an angry and wronged, illegitimate child. It was very tiring. He didn't want to act anymore. "Accompany me to drink." He stared at Gong Dian like a refugee staring at a piece of pork belly. "I'll seal up Baiyue brothel and call 60 girls to accompany you." Truly, truly crazy. Gong Dian's eyes were bright and full of expression as he stared back at him. He placed a hand on his forehead. There was a manor by the side of Xinhuai Alley. This residence did not take up a large amount of space. The overhanging eaves and walls were not very magnificent. Its location was also not very good. It intersected with the surrounding private residences and was not very different. This manor belonged to an old imperial censor of the previous dynasty. After this old imperial censor retired and returned to his hometown, the residence was left empty and handed to a few old colleagues to manage. Thinking that it would be more convenient for his descendants when they sought a future in Jingdou, he had no intention of selling it. 3 years ago, this manor was still sold. From then on, the quiet Xinhuai Alley became lively. Occasionally, officials would come to visit. During the New Year and other festivals, the crowd at the entrance was like a dragon. It was extraordinarily lively. Following the gradual promotion of the new master of the imperial censor's manor, there were fewer and fewer officials who came to visit because the new master's incorruptible reputation gradually spread. No one wanted to touch his bad luck. The imperial censor of the left, the traveling scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, He Zonwei, was the new master of this imperial censor's manor. In reality, his colleagues had all advised against it. Even the emperor had once mentioned that most of the officials lived in the south of the city. It was inconvenient for He Zonwei to live in the old imperial censor's manor in Xinhuai Alley. Furthermore, it did not match the dignity of a court official. Scholar He, who was in the same light as the dust in court matters, deeply understood the samadhi of officialdom and was greatly appreciated by the emperor and admired by his colleagues, was very insistent on this matter. He even refused the emperor's edict to bestow him a residence. He still brought his 2 or 3 loyal servants, a widowed aunt, and a few distant brothers to live in this old imperial censor's manor. He lived there for 3 years. His own way pushed open the door and walked into the somewhat dilapidated courtyard of the old imperial censor's manor. Looking at the messy spring scenery and the green leaves scattered everywhere, he couldn't help but shake his head self-mockingly. The reason he had always lived in this old imperial censor's manor was because he had feelings for it. Furthermore, this manor represented many important meanings to his life. The first time He Zonwei truly stepped onto the stage of the Qin Kingdom was when Prime Minister Lin Ruofu resigned from his post 5 years ago. He Zonwei coincidentally met the wife of the prime minister's strategist, Wu Boan. Feeling indignant, he went to the imperial censor to file a complaint against the emperor. He then coincidentally met the prime minister's killer. He then coincidentally met the second prince and the heir, Li Hongsheng. After a series of coincidences, he coincidentally followed the general trend of the Qing court at the time and forcefully brought down Prime Minister Lin Ruofu. He Zhongwei, who had missed the spring examinations because he was in mourning, was still a commoner. In everyone's eyes, he had brought down a treacherous prime minister with the strength of an ordinary man. At that moment, his reputation rose. In the hearts of scholars, no one saw him as just a Jingdo talent on par with Hou Jichang. Instead, they saw him as a remarkable figure with great ambition and a determined temperament. It was also through the incident of Prime Minister Lin's fall that He Zhongwei was able to see the emperor's face for the first time. From that day on, he was deeply convinced by the emperor's bearing and schemes. It was also that day that the emperor also took a fancy to this young scholar. With an imperial edict, he had him enter the imperial censor and become an imperial censor. In the following years, He Zhongwei dealt with various powers and finally successfully ascended. He became the youngest scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs in the history of the Qing Kingdom. His limelight flourished and was unparalleled. Of course, that was because no one would compare him to that person. Even though he was scholar he, in the hearts of thousands of people in the Qing Kingdom, that person would forever be the only one, the high and lofty one. In He Zhongwei's heart, that person was a shadow. This shadow floated above his head and blocked out the limitless light of his life, leaving only a patch of darkness and coldness. That shadow was Fan Xian. When He Zhongwei received the unanimous praise of the scholars because of Prime Minister Lin's matter, Fan Xian had already exposed the scandal of the spring examination and made 15 officials of the court, including the Minister of the Board of Rights, dead people. Furthermore, there was also the poem that night in front of the palace. When He Zhongwei was still a common imperial censor in the imperial censor, Fan Xian was already the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. He had forced the emperor to beat the imperial censors in front of the royal palace. Those imperial censors were He Zhongwei's seniors and superiors. When He Zhongwei finally welcomed the most glorious moment of his life, Fan Xian still only looked at him with disdain. With one hand, he held the Overwatch Council. With the other, he held the palace treasury. Now, he had seized back a large piece of land for the Qing kingdom, Dongyi. He was a talent, and the other was an immortal poet. He was a scholar, and the other was the Duke of Dambois. Most importantly, he was just a poor child of a poor family, and the other was the emperor's illegitimate child. No matter when, no matter where, Fan Xian firmly pressed down on him until he almost couldn't breathe. He Zhongwei looked at the spring garden in front of him. He looked at the messy grass growing without anyone taking care of it and sank into silence. He knew that in this life, no matter how hard he worked, he would never be able to surpass that person. He Zhongwei slowly closed his eyes and sighed helplessly. He had great confidence in his abilities and willpower. He didn't think he was any worse than Fan Xian. However, fate had long decided this. What could he do? He heard that Sir Yin Jr. of the Overwatch Council kept a few vicious dogs at home, forcing no court officials to visit. He also heard that Fan Xian kept countless guards at home. If anyone shamelessly came to give gifts, they would all be chased out of the manor. He Zhongwei's manor couldn't afford to keep dogs or people, but it had raised a black face. In order to maintain his impartial and incorruptible image, He Zhongwei had paid a great price. Furthermore, he could not be as unreasonable as the two people in the Overwatch Council. He had to reject bribes and also not make the other party feel uncomfortable. Thus, He Zhongwei was also very tired. At least, he thought he was much more tired than Fan Xian. The salary of court officials was not much. It was only 1/3 of the salary of officials of the same rank in the Overwatch Council. Additionally, He Zhongwei had a reputation for being incorruptible, so it was difficult to maintain the manor's expenses. Although the emperor knew of his family's poverty and had the internal court bestow a great deal of gold and silver, Traveling to and from Jingdo was always too expensive. What He Zongwei worried about the most was not Sun Jingxiu of the Jingdo government, but whether or not he should spend money to repair the garden. He Zongwei let out a bitter laugh. Who knew how much he had sacrificed for the sake of such glory? He was not like Fan Xian, who had a large palace treasury to support and a bookstore and brothel to support him. Strangely, the harder his life was, the calmer He Zongwei's expression was, and the happier he felt. It was as if there was a kind of painful torture that could make him truly understand the meaning of his existence. He wanted to do great things for the court. He wanted to become a truly famous official. He Zongwei's eyes grew brighter and brighter. Looking at the chaotic spring garden in the night, he didn't say a word. He only thought to himself, Fan Xian had indeed gone to the Sun Manor today. When the Hall of Governmental Affairs discuss matters tomorrow, what kind of attitude should I have? Earlier, the eunuch in the palace had brought the emperor's verbal edict. It had made his heart more at ease, but it had also made it more depressing. I have to find another way. He Zongwei lowered his head in the night wind. What great things! What famous official! Under Fan Xian's pressure, he had to first ensure that he could continue living after the emperor died. Thus, before the emperor died, he had to let Fan Xian die first. Chapter 662. It rained intermittently during the day, sometimes falling and sometimes stopping. After nightfall, not even small puddles of water formed on the streets of Jingdo. It was just so wet that it made one feel a sliver of sticky annoyance. In the chaotic spring garden of New Scholar Tree Alley, plants grew like crazy, just like a person's ambition and lofty aspirations. A great deal of rainwater accumulated in the grass nests and in the eyes of the flowers. It was like a beautiful and alluring jar of honey. He Zongwei silently turned his back to the study and looked at the spring garden washed by the rain. The honey in his heart gradually melted. He knew that his thoughts were beautiful but also dangerous. The slightest carelessness would result in eternal damnation. Fan Xian was not so easy to kill. What shocked He Zongwei even more was that in his 6 years of contact with Fan Xian, he could always see a glimmer of murderous coldness in the young official's eyes. He was now the imperial censor of the left and a scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Without the emperor's personal command, the Overwatch Council could not touch him. Fighting against Fan Xian in court had, for a time, attracted countless officials to come to him. It looked like he was in limitless glory, but only he knew that he was actually walking down a path of death. His present situation was truly precarious. If the trend in court continued like this, He Zongwei's future focus would still be on the imperial censorate to keep the Overwatch Council in check. However, once the emperor passed, could this situation still be maintained? Regardless of whether the third prince sat on the throne or some other shocking change, it made no difference to He Zongwei. It only depended on when he stepped down and how much he was suppressed. However, He Zongwei had no solution to this trend. If he continued like this, step by step, even if he became the head scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, what power would he have when facing the person on the dragon chair in the future? He had once tried to find an opportunity to get close to the third prince deep in the palace and seek the greatest support for the rest of his life. All his attempts these 3 years had been forcefully cut off by an unknown power when he was about to approach the inner palace. It was because of these failures that he realized with horror just how powerful the power in Fan Xian's hands was. His influence in the royal palace was far more terrifying than anyone could imagine. Because of his fear, and because he knew his future would not be pretty, He Zongwei wanted to stand against Fan Xian more and more, particularly after the emperor had personally appointed a marriage with the intention of easing the relationship between his two beloved generals. However, he had been forcefully refused by Fan Xian. Other than disappointment, He Zongwei knew that he had no other path to take. Perhaps the emperor was just a little angry, but He Zongwei was afraid from the bottom of his heart. Although the emperor was Fan Xian's father, his understanding of Fan Xian was not as profound as He Zongwei's. There was an old saying that the people who understood you the most were often not your family or friends, but your enemies. Zhongwei knew that Fan Xian would not let him go. He would not be like the emperor and truly think that Fan Xian was a pure and solitary official who put the interests of the Qing kingdom first in everything. In his eyes, Fan Xian was a strange being who always put his likes and dislikes first. It had to be said that Zhongwei's judgment of Fan Xian was correct. There was no hatred in Zhongwei's eyes. There was only a faint self-mockery and an icy coldness. He left the messy spring garden and returned to the study. The decorations in the study were relatively simple, but there were many books and account books piled on the bookshelves on either side. He walked to the side of the bookshelf and thought for a moment. From an unremarkable position, he pulled out a small booklet. Then, he sat beside the desk and began to examine it carefully. This small booklet was the list of names the Ministry of Rights and the Internal Court had worked together to compile after the Jingdo Rebellion. Zhongwei was in charge of the imperial censorate and had the emperor's trust. A long time ago, he had gotten his hands on this list. Furthermore, he had read it countless times in this quiet study. The third page, page 42, was the most wrinkled. It looked like it was the place he had flipped through the most. Before and after these 2 pages were the birthplaces and names of the 100 Tiger Guards who had died for the country and the people of the Overwatch Council who had died in the line of duty on Dongshan Road. There were 2 names that stood out. One was Gouda, and the other was Wang Qinian. Regardless of whether it was this small booklet, the Ministry of Right's final seal, the Overwatch Council's request for credit, or the Internal Court's final approval, they all determined that these 2 people were dead. However, Zhongwei did not believe it. From a long time ago, he did not believe that these 2 people were dead. Even though he later confirmed that these 2 people were among the bodies collected on Dong Mountain, he still did not believe it. The Overwatch Council could easily do such a thing. It was still the same thing. Zhongwei understood Fan Xian better than the emperor. What made him suspect this was because of some small details these few years. First of all, Gouda and Wang Qinian were Fan Xian's most trusted aides. They should not have died so quietly in the emperor's eyes. In the emperor's eyes, they were both unremarkable people. In Zhongwei's eyes, these 2 people had their own importance. Secondly, he had been watching Fan Xian in secret these few years, watching his every move, including when Fan Xian had taken Fan Rou and the Overwatch Council officials to the mausoleum a few days ago. Not long after the matter, he had heard the news and had personally gone to investigate. Just like in the past few years, Fan Xian's visit to the memorial garden was as quiet as ever. Most importantly, Fan Xian did not purposely stop in front of the 2 graves with Wang Qinian and Gao Da's names written on them and burn some paper money. Fan Xian was a very protective official who cared for his subordinates, particularly trusted aides who had died. Logically speaking, they should not have received such treatment. In the end, the reason Zhongwei made up his mind to determine that these 2 people were not dead was another small detail. After he became suspicious, he began to use the power of the imperial censorate to secretly watch from the side and let out a cry. Gouda had never married or had children in his life. After his death, his troubles ended. But Wang Qinian, the head of the Overwatch Council stationed in northern Qi, had a wife, a daughter, and a family. Although the Overwatch Council gave him a pension every year, no one knew who had taken it. Most importantly, after Wang Qinian died, it was said that his entire family had moved back home. In the Wang family's hometown, no one had discovered the whereabouts of this family. If Wang Qinian had truly died, Fan Xian would certainly be responsible for the Wang family's daily life. Given his personality, he would not allow Wang Qinian's widow and daughter to wander the world miserably. Wang Qinian did not die. Naturally, Gouda did not die either. Why were the bodies of the 2 people who did not die on Dong Mountain? Why did the Overwatch Council help them hide it? On Dong Mountain, 100 Tiger Guards shed hot blood to block the sword. Gouda was among them. So why did he not die? Had he escaped at the last moment? Wang Qinian had been by the emperor's side at the top of the mountain. If he had not died, why was there no sign of him afterward? Could it be that when the emperor was in danger, he had already escaped? Zhongwei slowly closed the scroll. A slight smile rose to the corners of his lips. He thought to himself, The powerful subordinate that Sir Fan Jr. had brought indeed had Fan Xian's style at a critical moment. He ran faster than anyone and saw himself as more important than anyone else. This was a great crime of deceiving the emperor. This crime was punishable by death by 1,000 cuts. He Zhongwei understood the emperor's personality too well. As long as someone betrayed him, or rather, as long as an official placed their life before the emperor's safety, he would fly into a thunderous rage and be ruthless in his heart. Furthermore, there are many people who deceive the emperor. If Wang Qinian and Gao De were captured and brought back, it would be difficult for them to escape death. What about the Overwatch Council? What about Fan Xian? He Zhongwei took a deep breath. His young and tired face immediately appeared a bit livelier and more austere. When it came to Fan Xian, he could not find any openings to attack. Thus, he could only wait for that wretched day. Unless, before the emperor died, he could incite the relationship between the emperor and Fan Xian. To incite the relationship between a father and son, one had to use such an illusory method as intentions. The crime of deceiving the emperor was something that destroyed one's heart. When all was said and done, this was probably Fan Xian's only lifeline in this life. He was too sentimental. If he had directly killed Gao De and Wang Qinian, none of this would have happened. Thinking of this, He Zhongwei couldn't help but smile and shake his head. Immediately after, he lowered his head and gently tapped the teacup on the table, making a ding sound. Before long, two people walked in. One of them was about 30 years old with a respectful expression on his face. Looking at his facial features, he was rather similar to He Zhongwei's. The other person was about 50 years old, but still wore the attire of a Confucian scholar. Wang Qinian, Gao De. He Zhongwei didn't hold back on his choice of words. Straightforwardly, he said, "We've been investigating these two people for over a year. Do you have any clues?" The person who looked like He Zhongwei was actually a distant cousin. His voice was slightly raspy as he replied, "I vaguely caught some clues. However, when the Overwatch Council does things, even if you catch wind of it, you won't be able to catch up. Everything stopped 3 years ago. Even if these two people still have secret connections to the Overwatch Council, I'm afraid it's still a place we can't touch." He Zhongwei furrowed his brows and nodded. He knew that given the power of the Overwatch Council, regardless of whether Director Chun personally acted or Fan Xian made the arrangements, the officials in court alone would not be able to move that metal plate. Unless he secretly ordered the Ministry of Justice and Supreme Court to go out and capture them. The problem was that this had to be done in secret. The Ministry of Justice and Supreme Court had Overwatch Council spies hidden within them. Once his actions alerted Fan Xian and caused the other party to block this opening or even secretly do something vicious out of anger, it was not something He Zhongwei wanted to see. "Sir, we won't be able to find anything in this matter by ourselves. The bodies on Dong Mountain have been counted. Although I don't know how the Overwatch Council did it, the number of people matched up with the name list. Furthermore, there was a fire on the mountain path at that time. The faces were burned like that, so it was impossible to say anything wrong." The slightly older scholar still didn't say anything. The person who spoke was He Zhongwei's distant cousin. This person had only begun to work for He Zhongwei in recent years. He handled matters cautiously and was already He Zhongwei's trusted aide. Thus, he had been sent to investigate this major matter. His words were also relatively direct. During the Jingdo Rebellion, the North Expedition Army happened to surround the mountain. At least a few thousand people died in that battle. It would not be difficult for the Overwatch Council to secretly do something and move two bodies. He Zhongwei lowered his head and furrowed his brows as he calculated. Even if there was a fire on the mountain path, what about on the summit? Although the battle between the Grandmasters was powerful, not many people died in front of the ancient temple. Back then, weren't Rin Zhengqing and the officials of the Ministry of Rights all alive and well? Why did Wang Qinian die? Did he die at the summit or on the path down the mountain? If his body was not burned, something strange could be found. But 3 years have already passed. The body has long turned to ash. If they say the one buried in the grave is Wang Qinian, they can only accept it as Wang Qinian. The scholar finally opened his mouth. Once he spoke, he went straight to the point. Thus, to investigate what happened a few years ago again would be too difficult. Secondly, we would never be able to find any problems. If you truly want to open a path in this direction, I think it is more important to find Wang Qinian and Gao Da alive. His own way sank into silence. Of course, he knew his strategist's opinion was correct. The problem was if Gao Da and Wang Qinian were hiding in Dongyi or northern Qi and concealing their identities, who will be able to dig out these two living people? You can leave first. His own way raised his head and said to his cousin in an even voice, "This matter involves the face of the court. Be careful." He had already established himself in the center of the court for 3 years and had gathered some power, particularly the emperor, who had secretly given him some help. However, compared to Fan Xian, he was still a long way off. This cousin was the most important person to help his own way carry out the shameful things. It was true that the He household was incorruptible, but if his own way wanted to gain a foothold in the court, he still needed money. He needed to support a large group of subordinates who were loyal to him. That cousin was the person who dealt with this matter. There was only his own way and the elderly strategist left in the study. It appeared rather quiet. After a moment of silence, his own way said, "If we can actually capture Wang Qinian and Gao Da alive and bring them back to Jingdo, what do you think will happen?" "Sir Fan Jr. will certainly protect these two people." The strategist lowered his head slightly. The strategist lowered his head slightly and said, "Given the Emperor's personality, if this matter does not become too big, perhaps he will give Sir Fan Jr. face and cover it up." "You mean, even if these two people have committed the crime of deceiving the Emperor will let them go?" A cold light appeared in his own way's eyes as he spoke in an icy voice. A complicated feeling rose in his heart. If the Emperor was truly benevolent enough to let those two people go, then what was the point of him working so hard? The key is to see what kind of price Sir Fan Jr. will pay for these two subordinates. The strategist smiled bitterly. Everyone under heaven knows that Sir Fan Jr. treats his subordinates very well. If he really shed all pretense of cordiality and insisted on protecting these two people, what would the Emperor do? Was he supposed to just kill him? "Sir, don't forget, Sir Fan Jr. is, in the end, the Emperor's own son." "Own son?" His own way slowly closed his eyes. The Crown Prince and Second Prince are also the Emperor's own sons. These words are not false. However, the Crown Prince and Second Prince did not help the Emperor take down Dongyi without bloodshed. When a strategist said the words Second Prince, his voice trembled. Immediately after, he said in a quiet voice, "To use a piece of territory to exchange for the lives of two subordinates, the Emperor still has this bit of benevolence." Of course, the strategist glanced at the disappointed his own way and lightly said, "Even if we can't force the Emperor and Sir Fan Jr. to turn against each other, we can at least plant a thorn in the Emperor's heart." His own way shook his head and opened his eyes to look calmly at the strategist in front of him. "Fan Wujio, you were originally one of the Second Prince's 8 generals. Because of the Second Prince's death, your hair turned white overnight. You have come to join me. Our goals are the same, so you know that if Fan Xian doesn't die, then I will. If you want to avenge the Second Prince, you have to think clearly. One thorn is far from enough." This old strategist, who looked to be over 50 years old, was one of the most capable 8 generals under the Second Prince, Fan Wujio. Back then, the Second Prince and Fan Xian had a chaotic battle in Jingdo. The 8 generals had all died or been injured. However, Fan Wujio had long ago seen that Fan Xian's power could not be stopped. After trying to persuade the Second Prince was useless, he had quietly left. Unexpectedly, many years later, after the Second Prince had taken poison and committed suicide, Fan Wujio had returned to Jingdo and thrown himself under his own way's wing, wholeheartedly seeking revenge for the Second Prince. Fan Wujio was silent for a long time. He then quietly said, "If you want to make a big deal out of this, then it cannot be done in secret. It must be made known to the entire court." The Emperor is someone who values face the most. At that time, No matter how powerful Sir Fan Jr. is, he will probably not be able to stop the murderous knife in the Emperor's hand. If the Emperor really kills Wang Qinian and Gao this time, I am very curious as to what Fan Xian will do. He Zhongwei smiled slightly and said, other than the Emperor and the internal court, I can't think of anyone else who would be able to find those two people under the cover of the Overwatch Council in this vast sea of people. There is one most important problem. Fan Wujiu calmly looked into He Zhongwei's eyes. If you want to secretly report to the Emperor, you will probably have to take a great risk yourself. Oh, what do you mean? He Zhongwei did not reveal a trace of panic. He only asked indifferently. You do not have concrete evidence at hand, only some guesses and analysis. Of course, just based on these guesses and analysis, it should be enough to make the Emperor suspicious. Fan Wujiu glanced at him again and quietly said, the Emperor will probably be suspicious of Sir Fan Jr., but he will also be suspicious of you. I am wholeheartedly loyal to the court and the Emperor. Why does the Emperor suspect me? He Zhongwei pressed his lips tightly together and said quietly, the Emperor will suspect that you are purposely trying to drive a wedge between him and Sir Fan Jr. He Zhongwei was silent for a long time. If the Emperor truly becomes suspicious and no longer protects me, what do you think will happen to me? If the Emperor doesn't like a person, there are many ways to deal with them. I think that in 3 years, the Emperor will find an excuse to leave the Jingdou court and take up a post in a distant place. Then, you will certainly be mediocre for the rest of your life, Fan Wujiu calmly said. He Zhongwei smiled bitterly and sighed. His eyes were filled with calmness and determination. If I make a move, I may be swept into the dust in the future. But if I don't make a move, I will be crushed into pieces. Which one will you choose? He gazed at Fan Wujiu and smiled slightly. I choose the former because, at least, I can continue to live. If Fan Xian truly becomes hostile with the Emperor, it will be difficult for him to continue living. Fan Wujiu blinked his eyes. His grizzled hair was particularly eye-catching in the dark study. Faintly, he said, you seem to have some resentment toward the Emperor. He Zhongwei's expression did not change, but the emotions in his heart churned endlessly. He had endless gratitude toward the Emperor, but he also had endless resentment. If the Emperor had not brought him up to fight Fan Xian, how could he be constantly trapped in a precarious predicament? How could he be so afraid of dying without a burial ground? Back then, the second prince was actually in a similar situation as you are now. Fan Wujiu smiled slightly darkly and quietly advised, so, you must learn from the second prince's lesson and maintain a loyal heart toward the Emperor. If you truly pull out Wang Qinian and Gao De, perhaps the Emperor will not suspect you. The one who will be out of luck will be Fan Xian. I have always been loyal to the Emperor. He Zhongwei calmly replied and lightly swept his gaze over Fan Wujiu. He knew what this person was trying to test. To avenge the death of the second prince, Fan Xian was naturally one of Fan Wujiu's targets. That heartless and cold-blooded Emperor could not escape Fan Wujiu's eyes. He Zhongwei mockingly said, a person needs to know where his own abilities lie. Dealing with Fan Xian is almost beyond our abilities. As for those people who are above the clouds, it is best not to even think about them. They will kill you. This is a corrected version. It should have been Fan Wujiu, but I wrote it as Fan Bian. I confused it with Xie Bian. Apologies. Chapter 663. After Fan Wujiu heard He Zhongwei's cold words, he slowly lowered his head and did not have any obvious reaction. After a moment of silence, he said in a low voice, before reporting to the Emperor, you should think of a way to investigate more clearly. Of course. All right, it's late. You should go rest, He Zhongwei said casually. He waved his hand and picked up the files on the table again. Fan Wujiu glanced at He Zhongwei. A glimmer of darkness flashed through his eyes. He bowed, and took his leave. When he walked out of the study, He Zhongwei immediately put down the files in his hands. He looked silently in the direction of the door and sank into deep thought. He Zhongwei was initially fearful of the second prince's 8 trusted generals joining him. After all, There were many people in Jingdo who knew of Fan Wuzhou's identity. If people discovered this in the future and it got into the palace, who knew what the emperor would think? Back then, the second prince had been one of the conspirators in the rebellion. It was indeed risky for He Zhongwei to take in his old subordinates. However, he had quickly made a decision. After all, Fan Wuzhou had his own abilities. Although the 8 generals whose names had spread through the Jianghu in Jingdo seemed unable to withstand a single blow in front of the Overwatch Council, in reality, they were all very powerful figures. The second prince had operated in court for a long time. The trusted aides he kept at his side were, of course, the most outstanding. Other than Fan Wuzhou's ability, He Zhongwei had taken him in for 2 other important reasons. First, this person's goal was the same as his. They both wanted to defeat Fan Xian. Second, this person also controlled some of the resources the second prince had left behind. The second prince had already lost and died 3 years ago. His power in court had long been swept clean by the emperor and Fan Xian. In the end, there were still some officials hidden in the lower levels of the court who were waiting for an opportunity in the dark. Regardless of whether it was to avenge their master or find a new master, they would see the light of day again. He Zhongwei needed these people. These people also needed scholarship in court. However, He Zhongwei could not personally gather these powers. He had to go through Fan Wuzhou. Only then could he appear more innocent in front of the emperor. When all was said and done, He Zhongwei was walking on a lonely steel rope with endless abysses on both sides. It was very dangerous. Not long after Fan Wuzhou left the study, the cousin of the He clan who had left earlier quietly returned. The two of them met each other's eyes and saw the glimmer of emotion in each other's eyes. He Zhongwei smiled warmly and said, "Go investigate the whereabouts of Wang Qinian and Gao. Don't use the people the second prince left behind." The person bowed respectfully and replied, "I understand." After you and Fan talked earlier, sir, Fan, and Fan. He Zhongwei nodded approvingly. There are some things that are inconvenient for Mr. Fan to know. There were many things that were inconvenient for Fan Wuzhou to know. Earlier, Fan Wuzhou and He Zhongwei had discussed that if they wanted to bring down Fan Xian, they had to start with Wang Qinian and Gao De, who might still be alive. However, given the power left behind by He Zhongwei and the second prince, it was impossible to pierce through the layers of black fog of the Overwatch Council and find true clues. Thus, Fan Wuzhou suggested that He Zhongwei directly meet the emperor and use the emperor's suspicions to have the internal court act. The problem was that He Zhongwei had a power in his hands. It was a power the emperor had given him, a power that no one knew about. The emperor trusted Chen Pingping incomparably and doted on Fan Xian. However, the Overwatch Council's power was truly too great. If it was only checked and balanced from the outside, an emperor would not be at ease. That was why there was the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Furthermore, the palace must have planted many trusted aides in the Overwatch Council. Concerning this matter, Chen Pingping and Fan Xian were both aware of it. However, there was no need to make things clear to the emperor. They were only guarding against it in secret. Since the Imperial Censorate wanted to challenge the Overwatch Council, the spies, the Internal Court, or perhaps the Ministry of Internal Affairs, had planted in the Overwatch Council had slowly moved from Eunuch Yao's side to He Zhongwei's hands 3 years later. This power, darker than the night, was currently controlled by He Zhongwei's cousin. He Zhongwei was silent for a moment and then said, "Investigate from the outside. If the Overwatch Council still has connections to Wang Qinian, then there will certainly be traces. However, don't let these people know exactly what you are investigating. If the emperor knows you're investigating and asks, what will we do? The emperor will not care about such small matters." He Zhongwei lowered his head slightly. "After the investigation is complete, report to the emperor and ask him to make a decision." Of course, if He Zhongwei grasped this important matter that could incite the relationship between the emperor and Fan Xian, he would not quietly and secretly report it to the emperor and give the emperor and Fan Xian a chance to privately negotiate. Instead, he would do everything in his power to blow this matter up. The person understood the hidden meaning in Fan Xian's words and didn't say anything more. Straightforwardly, he said, "I will not disappoint you." The study once again returned to silence. Hizongwei sat behind the desk and couldn't resist shaking his head. He didn't have a servant, but he had a few advisors. However, those advisors were all forbidden from entering the back garden. Other than his trusted aides, no one dared to go near this study. He knew that if he could truly trust Fan Wujiu, then this matter would certainly proceed more easily. However, he could not completely trust Fan Wujiu, particularly when he appeared in front of him as a strategist. For people like strategists, Hizongwei always had the greatest suspicions in his heart. Many years ago, he had successfully made a name for himself by bringing down Lin Ruofu. In reality, he knew that the fall of the previous prime minister had little to do with him. This was the emperor's intention. The person who truly carried out the order and gave the prime minister the heaviest blow was the seemingly handsome and carefree strategist in the prime minister's manor, Yuan Hongdao. Back then, Hizongwei had brought Wu Bo and wife to live in this old royal manor. Under the eldest princess's orders, he was in contact with the prime minister's manor and had dealings with Yuan Hongdao. He knew what kind of dangerous knife Yuan Hongdao had stabbed in this matter. The truth that had been slowly revealed a few years ago shocked him even more. Yuan Hongdao was actually a member of the Overwatch Council. The Overwatch Council? Hizongwei's heart felt a glimmer of coldness. He was very afraid of the Overwatch Council's power. Although he now held some internal members of the Overwatch Council in his hands, the more he understood about the Overwatch Council, the more afraid he was. He was afraid that the gardener in his manor was a spy from the first bureau of the Overwatch Council. He was afraid that the chubby female servant was an assassin from the 6th Bureau. He was afraid that the food he ate every day was laced with slow-acting poison from the 3rd Bureau. He was afraid that even Fan Wujiu, the strategist the second prince had left behind, might also be a member of the Overwatch Council. Would he, in the future, stab his body with the most ruthless knife? He wanted to deal with Fan Xian, so he was even more afraid that Fan Xian would deal with him. It had already been a number of years. He had received everyone's respect in court. When he returned to the manor, he was immersed in an unhealthy feeling of fear and unease. He always felt that everyone he saw in the manor could have been sent by the Overwatch Council. Thus, the He Manor did not have many servants and girls. He used very few people. Even if he had no choice but to use people, he would rather go through great hardship to find his brothers from his hometown. Unexpectedly, this had earned him a reputation for being honest and modest. Sometimes, Hizongwei even felt that he was about to be driven crazy by this nervous feeling. Crazy, but he could not go crazy. He had to obtain the final victory. He had already found a glimmer of an obscure yet blinding white light at the edge of the dark sky. He pushed open the door and stood alone in the corridor. His face was slightly pale, and his mood was unusually heavy. Occasionally, he would think of that woman, and a trace of pain would appear in his eyes. No one knew what kind of torment scholar he was suffering in his heart. No one thought he was a person who was about to go crazy. A few days after the birthday banquet in the Sun Manor, the civil and martial officials in court, and even the scholars and common people who had heard some rumors, all knew that he had lost this battle. He had lost completely. The emperor did not issue an edict. Instead, he had Hizongwei handle the matter of the Jingdo magistrate himself. It was clear he wanted to use this matter to establish He's authority in court. Unexpectedly, after Fan Xian returned from Dongyi, drank some wine, went to the palace to argue, and took a trip to the Imperial College, he had beaten back He's extended hand. As for He's loss of face and failure, no one found it strange. After all, the opponent he faced this time was not an official of the 6 ministries in court or a disciple of the nobility. It was Fan Xian. It was fine if Fan Xian did not take action. As long as he set his mind to do something, he would always be able to do it. This had already become the common understanding of the entire world. It was clear that the emperor did not have any good ideas for this illegitimate child. After all, he was just a mere Jingdo magistrate. The emperor could not truly fall out with his most favored illegitimate child. The old accountant sent by the Ministry of Revenue to check accounts left the Jingdo government wretchedly. The secret investigation by the Ministry of Appointments and the Ministry of Justice was also fortunately brought to a halt under the powerful pressure from the mountain. Although the scholar did not say anything in the Hall of Governmental Affairs, he quietly reminded the officials in front of his own way. Although this sentence was light, it was also very heavy. Jingdo was clear and bright. It had long passed the April Qingming festival. The spring scenery was bright and beautiful. Dressed in casual clothes, Fan Xian sat on a horse. Holding a willow branch, he pointed toward the east and smiled and chatted about something with the officials, seeing him off. He had beaten He Zhongwei again and gained the upper hand in his argument with the emperor. At least, he ensured that the power on his side would not be weakened too much in a short period of time. Fan Xian was in a good mood. Even though he was about to embark on another journey and go to the medicinal sword hut in Dongyi to suffer, he was still in a good mood. After exchanging pleasantries with the officials, seeing him off, and accepting a large basket of flattery, as well as the cold and sour words secretly directed at his own way, Fan Xian's expression did not change. He left the pavilion, dismounted from his horse, and continued to hide in his family's black carriage. The surroundings were quiet, but there was another person in the carriage. Yin Bingyan looked at him and suddenly said, "There are already signs of unrest in Dongyi. Do you really not want me to go suppress it? This time, I will bring the Black Knights into the city." A faint worry rose between Fan Xian's brows. "The old director will be returning home in a few days. Stay here and watch for me. If you also leave with me, Hu and Jingdo will make decisions for the council." Yin Bingyun acutely saw the worry in his heart. He did not understand, but did not ask directly. Instead, he said, "He Zhongwei has lost a great deal of face this time. Presumably, the imperial censorate will be quiet for a long time. Don't underestimate him," Fan Xian said. "Although these officials said bad things about him in front of me today, if this was a different occasion and in front of his own way, who would dare to say anything loudly? The position of an official is still in the emperor's word. As long as the emperor's favor remains, he will not fall. Furthermore, he is a powerful character." Fan Xian suddenly smiled slightly. And said, "In the past, I always felt that his own way scale was too small. Unexpectedly, he did something unexpected." Yin Bingyan did not smile. Calmly, he said, "I found out that Fan Wujiu is in the He Manor. If you really want to deal with his own way, just let the emperor know." Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then shook his head and said, "Fan Wujiu's choice surprised me. Back then, when he fled Jingdo, it was clear that he was a cowardly person afraid of death. Unexpectedly, after the second prince died, he had the courage to return to Jingdo and carry out his so-called plan of revenge." He raised his hand to rub between his brows. Raising his face, he sighed in admiration. "Fan Wujiu's action is very old-fashioned. I admire it very much." Yin Bingyan furrowed his brows and said, "I don't believe that you admire his own way very much. I also don't believe that you would let his own way go because of something like old-fashioned. Right now, I have to take care of a major matter. Before the director returns home, you and I shouldn't do anything to prevent variables from happening," Fan Xian said seriously. The tip of Yin Bingyun's heart trembled slightly. There were not many things that could shock him, but from Fan Xian's words, he smelled a very dangerous scent. "There shouldn't be any problems," Fan Xian said quietly. "But there can't be any more incidents in the near future. There can't be any big movements in court. Let's not rush to do anything." "What is he Zhongwei rushing to do?" Yin Bingyun handed a piece of paper to his hand and calmly said, "Although I haven't found out, there have been some undercurrents in the council recently. I don't know the reason." Fan Xian sank into deep thought. He was not an immortal, and the Overwatch Council was not omnipotent. Furthermore, it was probably because of some emotional reasons that he did not want to think about whether or not old Wang, who had been closest to him, was doing well in the distance. For a moment, he had not thought about this. As for Gouda, Fan Xian had long thought he was dead. Fan Wujiu alone is enough to force his own way off the stage. It is as if we have a sharp weapon in our hands, Fan Xian said. If he Zonwei does make any big movements, throw Fan Wujiu out. There is no need for an official who takes in the old subordinates of a rebellious prince to continue staying in court. Yan Bingyun was silent for a moment. He then said, Sir, he has made a fatal mistake. Fan Xian said, that is because he thinks he understands the Emperor and the abilities of the Overwatch Council. In reality, he doesn't know anything. I made a mistake yesterday. It was a terrible mistake. It had nothing to do with mistakes in writing or words. It was purely a matter of not being serious enough. I apologize again to everyone. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.